Hey my dear listener, before we start, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Comment down where are you from and what's your time right now. Let's jump into the video. We'll now begin with story 1, the weight of stone and grain, agriculture in the Old World and the New. In the 12th century, most of Europe was green, not the deep, tropical green of the Americas, but a softer, colder shade. The kind that clings to damp earth and stone cottages. Fields stretched in strips, their edges marked by hedgerows or by the memories of where one family's plow ended and another's began. The people who worked these lands, bent-backed and quiet, lived by the rhythm of a calendar that never changed. You can almost hear the dull sound of wooden plows cutting into earth, slow, creaking, and inefficient. Metal was scarce. Iron-tipped tools were treasured, often passed down for generations. The soil, turned again and again, was tired. Much of northern Europe still followed the two-field system. One plot planted, one left fallow. They believed the land needed to rest, just as people did, though neither truly had the luxury of doing so. Crops were mostly cereals, barley, rye, oats, and where the soil allowed, wheat. In southern Europe, olive groves and vineyards hinted at a different climate, one that allowed for patience and trade. But for most peasants, bread was life and life was bread. If the harvest failed, so did the family. The church calendar ruled planting and harvest alike. Every feast day, every fast, every saint's celebration was a marker for labor. Monks wrote in Latin about the divine order of creation, but it was the peasants who felt that order in their bodies. Across the ocean, unseen, unknown, another world of farmers worked the soil with different tools, under different stars. In the high valleys of the Andes, Quechua-speaking farmers had long since terraced the mountainsides. Each step of stone and soil was a small triumph of geometry over gravity. They did not rest their fields but fed them, returning to the earth what they took in the form of guano and composted vegetation. To European eyes, their methods might have seemed impossibly complex, but they had evolved over centuries of careful trial, not divine instruction. Where Europe depended on beasts of burden, the Andes depended on muscle and memory. Their staple crop was not wheat, but the potato, a plant that thrived where little else could survive. It grew in cold, thin air, anchoring families and empires alike. The Inca would later build storehouses capable of preserving potatoes for years, transforming survival into strategy. In Mesoamerica, maize reigned. Cornfields were not solitary. They grew in a careful triad known as the milpa: maize, beans, and squash. Each plant supported the other. The corn grew tall, the beans climbed its stalks, and the squash shaded the soil. Together they formed a self-sustaining ecosystem, a quiet miracle that European agriculture would not replicate for centuries. Meanwhile, in the forests of the Mississippi Valley, the city of Cahokia was reaching its height. Surrounded by floodplains, its people managed soil and water with precision that rivaled Europe's manners. They built mounds not only for ceremony but for elevation defense against floods that came like clockwork. Beneath the surface, their society was one of farmers, traders, and planners. Europe, for all its castles and cathedrals, had nothing like Cahokia's engineered horizon. And yet, both worlds faced the same fundamental truth: soil is power. By the 12th century, Europe was already feeling the limits of its medieval system. Population growth outpaced productivity. Forests fell to the plow, wetlands drained, and yet famine remained constant. In England, the Doomsday Book of 1086 recorded not just who owned the land but how much of it lay waste. The word meant barren, unproductive, useless, a silent warning from the soil itself. In the Americas, the opposite was true. Populations rose alongside agricultural innovation. The Maya had declined centuries earlier, but their farming techniques lived on slash and burn in the lowlands, raised fields in the wetlands, terracing in the hills. Every environment, no matter how harsh, found its adaptation. The question of advancement, then, is not one of tools but of trust in land, in systems, in the cycle of growth and decay. Medieval Europe trusted God to provide. Pre-Columbian America trusted the earth itself. Europe's farmers prayed for rain. American farmers built canals to bring it. One civilization sought miracles, the other planned for them. Still, both labored under the same endless sky, their hands caked in the same brown memory of the earth. When the medieval plowman looked up at the horizon, he saw his limits. When the Andean farmer looked down from the mountain terraces, he saw his mastery. But perhaps the truest difference lay not in what they grew, but in how they measured abundance. Europe measured it in surplus and grain stored, tithes paid, taxes owed. The Americas measured it in stability and the steady rhythm of the seasons, in the assurance that the land would give if it was treated well. Even now, archaeologists can trace the fingerprints of these different philosophies in the soil itself. In Europe, layers of erosion and exhaustion. In the Andes, terraces that still hold firm after 6 centuries. One world sought dominion, the other sought balance. And yet, both would eventually fall to hunger. Because no matter how advanced a system becomes, the earth remembers every harvest, every drought, every mistake. When we think of progress, we often imagine innovation, the wheel, the plow, the forge. But in truth, progress may have always been a quieter thing, the understanding of how to live with the land rather than over it. So which was truly more advanced, the farmer who cut deeper into the soil, or the one who learned not to? Perhaps in that question lies the heart of the old world and the new. When you picture medieval Europe, you might imagine castles and knights, but those were only the surfaces of civilization. Beneath them, the real kingdoms lay in furrows and fields, in the unseen labor of millions who never held a sword or wore a crown. The soil itself was the true monarch, and those who tilled it lived by its moods. By the 13th century, Europe's agricultural landscape was changing not through invention, but through exhaustion. Forests had been cleared almost to their limits, especially in France and England. The great clearances opened up new land for crops, but the yields rarely justified the destruction. Peasants were working harder for smaller returns, their fields stretched thinner every decade. The shift from the 2-field to the 3-field system, a seemingly small innovation, changed the rhythm of life. Now, one field grew winter grains like wheat or rye, another held spring crops like oats or barley, and the third rested. It was, in many ways, a quiet revolution. Soil fertility improved, diets diversified slightly, and populations rose. But for every acre gained, another became dependent on luck and weather. Across Europe, the medieval climate was entering what historians call the medieval warm period. It brought longer summers and milder winters, enough to expand cultivation into northern lands that had once been too cold. Barley ripened in Scandinavia, vineyards appeared in England. The earth, for a brief moment, seemed generous. But generosity came with strings. As populations grew, so did vulnerability. A single failed harvest could ripple across an entire kingdom. Famine was no longer local, it was continental. From 1315 to 1317, the Great Famine would later sweep through much of northern Europe, killing millions. Yet before that disaster, there were already warning signs in the soil, a subtle decline in yield, a quiet desperation in the records of manor courts. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, farmers in the Americas were not only adapting to their environments but reshaping them. In Mesoamerica, the people we often call the Aztecs developed chinampas, floating gardens built in shallow lakes. These were not truly floating, but rather anchored rectangles of earth and vegetation, layered with mud dredged from the lake bottom. The result was astonishing productivity. Crops could be grown year-round, and the nutrient-rich sediment renewed itself naturally. Where European farmers struggled against their landscape, the Aztecs turned theirs into an ally. The lakes around Tenochtitlan, the great island city, glittered with green rectangles of cultivation. Maize, amaranth, and chilies thrived. Farmers maneuvered canoes between the plots, tending and harvesting with a precision that European manners could scarcely imagine. To the south in the Andes, the Inca Empire rose not from fertile plains, but from mountains that seemed almost hostile to agriculture. Yet their engineers built terraces with stone-retaining walls that preserved moisture and prevented erosion. Each level created a different microclimate, warmer below, cooler above, allowing farmers to grow multiple crops at once, from maize in the valleys to potatoes at the heights. What Europe called innovation, the introduction of the heavy plow, the horse collar, the water mill, was mechanical. What the Americas mastered was ecological innovation, adapting systems to place, not forcing place to fit system. But progress has many faces. In medieval Europe, monasteries became hubs of agricultural improvement. The Cistercians, for example, drained swamps, managed irrigation, and built granaries that doubled as economic centers. Their motivation was spiritual discipline, labor as a form of prayer, but their impact was technological. They standardized water-powered mills for grinding grain and fulling cloth, bringing a quiet efficiency to the landscape. Europe's advantage was energy, the ability to harness nature's forces, but the cost was dependency on machines, on climate, on landowners. In contrast, the agricultural systems of the Americas were less centralized but more resilient. There was no singular lord of the fields. Land was held communally in many societies, redistributed as needed by clan or village councils. The concept of private property in soil was alien. The earth was not owned, it was borrowed from ancestors and for descendants. This difference in worldview shaped everything. In Europe, famine was often met with divine explanations, punishment, sin, or misfortune. In the Americas, famine was a failure of harmony, a sign that balance between people and land had been broken. Ceremonies were held not to plead for rain, but to apologize to the earth. It would be wrong to romanticize this balance. Societies across the Americas also experienced ecological collapse, most famously among the classic Maya centuries earlier. Overfarming, drought, and political turmoil devastated their cities, but their descendants learned from it. The same regions that had been abandoned later supported thriving smaller communities with more sustainable practices. Europe, on the other hand, had yet to learn that lesson. By the late medieval era, yields were diminishing despite expanded acreage. The limits of technology met the limits of nature. Even as water mills multiplied and iron tools spread, the underlying issue remained. The land could only give so much. What separated these worlds was not intelligence, nor even efficiency, but philosophy. To the European farmer, the soil was a resource to be managed, something external, inert, waiting to be used. To the American farmer, the soil was a live part of a system of reciprocity that demanded care. And yet both were bound by the same quiet truth: hunger is the most consistent teacher in human history. As both hemispheres approached the dawn of the 15th century, the conditions were set for a collision, but neither side knew it yet. In Europe, manorial lords and church estates accumulated wealth through surplus grain, even as peasants starved. The division of land mirrored the division of class. Fields stretched outward, but ownership grew narrower. In the Andes and Mesoamerica, surplus had another purpose: storage and redistribution. Inca storehouses, known as calcas, could hold enough dried potatoes and maize to feed entire armies or sustain villages during drought. The state acted as granary and guardian, ensuring stability through control. In both cases, food was power. The difference lay in its distribution. Europe's feudal system rewarded production but punished the producers. The Americas rewarded balance but demanded obedience to collective rule. Neither system was entirely just, both were entirely human. And always, beneath it all, the soil recorded everything. In the pollen layers of old European fields, archaeologists find traces of exhaustion: wheat giving way to rye, rye to weeds. In the Andes, they find terraces still in use centuries later, their retaining stones unmoved. The contrast is not between intelligence and ignorance, but between time scales. One civilization sought short-term gain, the other long-term stability. As the medieval world pushed toward the Renaissance, the European hunger for land and resources would drive it beyond its boundaries. Ships would sail, not for curiosity, but for sustenance. And across the ocean, the lands they would reach were already rich not in gold, but in knowledge of how to live with the earth. Both worlds stood at the edge of a transformation they could not yet see. Europe's plows were deepening, its forests shrinking, its appetite expanding. The Americas were complex, interwoven, and sustainable, but vulnerable to what would come next. The story of agriculture is never just about crops or tools. It is about identity, about who we are when we depend on the land. When you trace the lines of a medieval furrow or stand upon a forgotten terrace high in the Andes, you see the same truth repeated. Civilization grows not from conquest, but from cultivation. Still, the question lingers like a shadow over history. When two worlds meet, one seeking to dominate the earth, and the other to serve it, which truly survives the encounter? When the first European ships reached the coasts of the Americas at the end of the 15th century, they carried not only iron and gunpowder, but an entire philosophy of land. To the men aboard those ships, land existed to be claimed. To those waiting beyond the shoreline, land was already claimed by memory, by lineage, by the breath of every harvest that had come before. It was not a meeting of equals, but it was a meeting of farmers. One had plowed deep into the soil of feudal order. The other had shaped mountains and marshes into quiet symphonies of growth. And for a brief moment in history, before conquest, before disease, before the unmaking, two visions of human progress stood face to face. The exchange that wasn't meant to be. In Europe, the medieval dream of abundance had always been haunted by hunger. The centuries following the Black Death had brought paradoxical prosperity. Fewer mouths to feed meant more land for the survivors. Wages rose, serfdom began to crack, and markets grew. Grain flowed not only into monasteries but into cities, feeding an emerging merchant class. But that same hunger, disguised now as curiosity and trade, would soon look outward. The soil of Europe could no longer sustain its ambitions. Forests had shrunk, and the population was once again growing. Even as the Renaissance celebrated human genius, its feet remained in mud, its hands still dependent on harvests that could fail without warning. The Americas, by contrast, had their own quiet empires of plenty. In the Andes, Inca storehouses still held thousands of tons of dried potatoes, maize, and quinoa. These were not luxury goods, they were the insurance of a civilization. When one region suffered drought, caravans of llamas carried food from another. It was a system designed not for expansion, but for endurance. In Mesoamerica, the Mexica fields around Tenochtitlan were works of living engineering. Chinampas produced yields that astonished even the first Spanish chroniclers, though those chroniclers rarely understood what they saw. To them, the floating gardens seemed magical, effortless. They did not realize that each one required constant care, dredging canals, layering organic matter, managing salinity, planting and replanting by the moon. It was work, not miracle, and it had been perfected over centuries. When Europe's explorers brought wheat, barley, and livestock to the New World, they believed they were bringing civilization. Yet what they truly brought was disruption. Fields that had thrived in balance were trampled by hooves. New crops demanded different soils, different rains. The careful networks that had once tied human life to ecosystem began to unravel. In return, the old world received something it had never expected: abundance on a scale that reshaped the globe. Potatoes from the Andes, maize from Mesoamerica, tomatoes from the valleys of Oaxaca, cacao, peanuts, chili peppers, these would travel farther than any sword or prayer. Within a century, the European diet was transformed. The potato, once a curiosity, became the foundation of empires. In Ireland, in Prussia, in Russia itself, It turned marginal lands into productive farms. Populations boomed once more, fueled by a root that could feed twice as many per acre as wheat ever could. But every gift has its shadow. Dependence on new crops made societies vulnerable again to blight, to monoculture, to the same cycles of famine they had briefly escaped. The Irish potato famine of the 19th century was not the failure of a crop alone, but the failure to remember what agriculture had once meant: diversity, patience, balance. The old world learned and forgot and learned again. The empires beneath the surface. The conquest of the Americas was not merely military, it was agricultural. Spanish colonists measured land in encomiendas, parcels granted for the right to extract both labor and food. The communal terraces and chinempas that had sustained entire civilizations were reorganized into estates. European plants were imposed on American soil, and with them, European hierarchies. Sugar became king. It consumed land, water, and lives. Where maize had once nourished villages, sugar fed markets an ocean away. Wheat replaced amaranth, cattle replaced llamas, the plow replaced the digging stick. And slowly, the rhythm of the land changed. In Europe, meanwhile, the agricultural revolution of the early modern period began to emerge from these same exchanges. New crops meant new possibilities. Maize thrived in Mediterranean climates, sweet potatoes in the south of Spain. Global trade brought fertilizers, seeds, and knowledge, but it also deepened dependence on markets, on prices, on invisible systems of exchange. The peasant's world rooted in local soil, and seasons gave way to a global field. Yet for all its advances, something was lost. Medieval Europe had been inefficient, yes, but it had been local. The grain grown in one valley fed that valley. When harvests failed, the suffering was immediate, visible. Now, food came from elsewhere, and the memory of dependence faded. Pre-Columbian farmers would have found this strange. To them, food was identity. Maize was not just sustenance, it was origin. In the Popol Vuh, the sacred book of the K'ich Maya, humanity itself is shaped from corn. The Inca spoke of the earth as Pachamama, a mother who gives but must be respected. The soil was alive, and in feeding from it, one entered into a sacred contract. That contract was broken when the fields became commodities. The archaeology of memory. Today, when archaeologists peel back the layers of soil in both hemispheres, they read a story written not in ink, but in pollen and carbon. Europe's fields reveal centuries of fatigue erosion, deforestation, and the ghost lines of medieval plows. In the Andes, terraces abandoned after the fall of the Inca still stand, their stones unshifted, their soil intact. Even now, local farmers reclaim them, planting potatoes in the same furrows their ancestors dug 600 years ago. It is tempting to see one as progress and the other as preservation. But history is never that tidy. Europe's exhaustion fed the innovations of the Enlightenment. The Americas' balance could not withstand foreign disease and conquest. Progress and loss walked hand in hand, and neither world escaped the cost of its choices. Still, there is something haunting about the contrast. The European field was finite, a cycle of growth, decay, and replacement. The American field was cyclical, a web of reciprocity. One saw the soil as property, the other as kin. And in the centuries that followed, that difference would echo louder than any sermon or canon. The silent victories of the earth. For all the destruction that followed the encounter, the legacy of the New World's agriculture endures everywhere. Each time you eat a potato, you participate in a system born in the Andes. Each kernel of corn carries within it the memory of a Mesoamerican field. Chocolate, vanilla, chili, peanut, all reminders of civilizations that measured wealth not in gold, but in growth. Even in the quiet countryside of modern Europe, the ghosts of medieval furrows remain visible from the air ridge and trough patterns fossilized beneath pasture. They are reminders of a time when a single harvest could determine life or death. when bread was sacred not for its taste, but for its promise. And across the ocean, the terraces of the Andes still breathe. Each stone wall catches rain, each channel directs it downward, each farmer's hand maintains a balance older than any nation. The system endures not because it is ancient, but because it works. Perhaps that is the most advanced achievement of all: survival. Civilization is often measured by monuments, cathedrals, pyramids, palaces. But maybe the truest monuments are the ones that still feed us, quietly, patiently. The grain field, the terrace, the chinempa, each one a technology of life. The Middle Ages in Europe ended with discovery. The Pre-Columbian world ended with loss. Yet beneath those endings lies a continuity that never broke. The soil still remembers both stories, intertwined beneath our feet. Reflections on progress. So who was more advanced? The question that began our journey cannot be answered with simple measures of technology or wealth. Medieval Europe learned to bend nature to its will, to transform scarcity into system. Pre-Columbian America learned to live within nature's will, to weave its cycles into the fabric of daily life. One sought control, the other harmony. Both achieved greatness, both fell to their own vulnerabilities. Perhaps advancement is not a ladder but a circle, one that brings us back, again and again, to the same question. How do we live with the land that sustains us? When you stand in a modern field, whether it is mechanized farmland in France or a potato terrace in Peru, you stand on centuries of memory. Beneath the topsoil lies the weight of every decision our ancestors made. To plow deeper, to plant smarter, to take more, or to give back. The soil, after all, never forgets. And somewhere in that quiet remembering, between furrow and root, between Europe and America, lies the true measure of what it means to be advanced. Story 2, Threads Across the Sea, Textiles, Trade, and the Quiet Empires of Cloth. If you were to trace the shape of civilization not through battles or empires, but through what people wore, you would find history running like a thread between continents. Before steel and gunpowder, before printing and the compass, there was cloth, fragile, perishable, endlessly remade, and yet more enduring than most kingdoms. In the 12th and 13th centuries, a merchant in Bruges might have run his hands over a bolt of English wool cloth so fine it felt like water. In the same years, far across the Atlantic, a woman in the valley of Oaxaca was sitting at her backstrap loom, her knees pressed into the earth, weaving cotton dyed with cochineal, the deep, impossible red that would one day drape the robes of European kings. Two worlds, two looms, and the same patient rhythm: up, down, tight, and breathe. The fabric of feudalism. In medieval Europe, clothing was never just clothing. It was rank made visible, labor made tangible. The poor wore wool coarse, thick, dyed if they were lucky in muted browns and grays. The wealthy wore silk and linen, imported from the Mediterranean or woven in domestic workshops by hands that would never touch such finery again. Wool was Europe's gold. Entire economies turned on its production. In England, monasteries grew rich on sheep. The great abbeys of Fountains, Revolks, and Kirkstall did not survive on prayer alone. They survived on wool exports to Flanders. There, in cities like Ghent and Ypres, the wool was washed, carded, spun, and woven into cloth that crossed the continent. The rhythms of feudal agriculture, the plow, the harvest, the tithe, were matched by the hidden rhythms of textile work. Women spun wool through the dark months of winter, fingers cracked from cold. Dyers boiled vats of woad and madder, turning gray cloth into the dull blues and reds that marked their trade guilds. Weavers, often men, worked the looms in small workshops or under the control of merchants who dictated what was made and when. Cloth moved across Europe like a currency of softness and status. A single bolt of fine wool might represent a year's wages. Silk, imported through Italian ports from Byzantium or the Levant, could be worth more than land. But what few considered was that each thread represented a history of domestication of sheep bred for finer fleece, of plants grown for stronger fibers. The medieval world was, in its own quiet way, a world built by hands that never stopped twisting and weaving. Across the ocean, another thread. Meanwhile, in the pre-Columbian Americas, cloth was also power, but of a different kind. Among the Inca, the most valuable possessions were not gold or silver, but textiles. A piece of fine come-by cloth, woven from vicuña wool, could serve as tribute, gift, or sacred offering. When the Sapa Inca rewarded a general, he gave him cloth, not coin. The labor that went into weaving such fabric was almost unimaginable to European eyes. Spinning alone could take months. The weavers, often women chosen for their skill, worked on looms without wheels, counting each thread by memory. Designs were not written down but carried in the mind, passed from mother to daughter. In the markets of Tlaxcala, the great twin city of Tenochtitlan, merchants sold mantles of cotton embroidered with feathers, dyed in colors so vivid they seemed unreal. The dyes themselves were marvels of chemistry: indigo from the annual plant, crimson from crushed cochineal insects, yellows and greens from roots and barks. Unlike in Europe, where most people wore muted tones, color was everywhere in trade, in ceremony, in daily life. To the Mexica, textiles were not mere goods. They were tribute. The Aztec Empire, like its Inca counterpart, measured its reach not only in land but in fabric. Provinces owed the central state bolts of cotton cloth, each one representing both submission and participation in the imperial network. It was cloth that tied people together, literally. The invisible empires. Europe's textile trade created an empire of merchants long before colonialism. The Hanseatic League in the north and the Italian city-states in the south controlled the arteries of cloth from raw wool to finished fabric. A bale of English wool could travel through Calais, be woven in Bruges, sold in Venice, and end up on a noble's back in Constantinople. Every step added value, and every hand along the way took a share. Taxes were collected, guilds enforced quality, and cities rose and fell with the fortunes of the cloth trade. When we think of medieval Europe, we often imagine knights and kings, but the real power was in counting houses, not castles. Cloth built cities. In the Americas, the same was true, though organized differently. There was no coinage, no written contracts, no banking system in the European sense, and yet the textile economy functioned with precision. Tribute records carved into Aztec codices list not gold but cloth. So many mantles, so many lengths of woven cotton. In the Andes, the Mita system of labor obligation included spinning and weaving as a form of service to the state. Women's work, as it was often called, was in fact the foundation of the empire. Every tunic worn by a soldier, every tapestry hung in a temple, every banner carried into war began at a spindle in a humble dwelling. The difference between cloth and clothing. The most striking difference between the two worlds lay in how each thought about adornment. In Europe, clothing was transformation. To dress above one's station was a sin. Sumptuary laws in places like Florence and Paris forbade commoners from wearing silk or bright dyes. Clothing could deceive, and so it had to be controlled. In the Americas, clothing was identity. Patterns, colors, and motifs declared not ambition but belonging to a family, a region, or a social role. An Andean textile could tell a story in geometric language: a square for fertility, a zigzag for water, a diamond for lineage. The cloth was both art and record. When a person died, their textiles were often buried with them not for wealth, but because the fabric was considered an extension of the self. Even today, Andean weavers repeat patterns that predate the Inca Empire, their meaning carried forward like whispered history. In Europe, by contrast, fashion devoured memory. Styles changed with each generation, each court, each royal whim. A garment's life was brief, its legacy shallow. Threads of faith. Monasteries and temples alike used textiles to bridge the human and the divine. In Europe, priests donned embroidered vestments heavy with gold thread, the product of months of labor. Altar cloths were prized as sacred relics, some said to work miracles. In the Andes, offerings of fine cloth likla and unku were burned or buried as gifts to the gods, the sacrifice of time made tangible. Both traditions linked weaving to creation itself. In Christian Europe, the Virgin Mary was often depicted spinning or weaving, her calm domesticity mirroring divine order. In the Andean world, goddesses like Mama Aklo were said to have taught humans the art of weaving, making it a sacred act. Perhaps in that, the two worlds were not so different. Both believed that to weave was to participate in creation, to bring structure to chaos, to impose order on loose strands of life. Unraveling the question, was Europe more advanced because it turned cloth into commerce? Was America more advanced because it turned cloth into culture? Progress depends on what one values. In the old world, textiles laid the foundation for capitalism, for trade networks, banking, and industry. In the New World, textiles preserved identity and memory in societies without writing. Both systems were intricate. Both required extraordinary knowledge. The difference, again, was philosophy. Europe wove for profit. The Americas wove for continuity. One sought expansion, the other expression. And yet, across an ocean neither knew existed, the same gestures persisted: the hum of the spindle, the tension of the warp, the satisfaction of the final knot. Two worlds, one rhythm. The story of cloth is the story of civilization, soft to the touch, hard to master, endlessly remade. It is the history of patience, of hands that never stopped working, and of a question that still threads through time. When every empire eventually unravels, what remains the wealth that was woven, or the pattern that was remembered? If you listen closely to the past, it hums. Not with the clash of swords or the chant of priests, but with the softer rhythm of fiber passing over fiber, the clatter of looms, the hiss of boiling dye, the whisper of wool being combed clean. Civilization was built not only on stone and steel, but on thread. And wherever thread gathered, power followed. The economics of thread. By the 14th century, wool was not just Europe's commodity, it was its lifeblood. The wealth of kingdoms, especially England and Flanders, depended on it. A single English sheep could feed a peasant, clothe a monk, and finance a lord. The saying went that the sheep hath eaten up the men, and in a way it had. The endless pastures of the Cotswolds and Yorkshire replaced villages once filled with farmers. Enclosure, the fencing off of common land, began as a quiet shift, then spread like ivy. Lords found they could make more profit grazing sheep than feeding tenants. The result was progress for a few and dispossession for many. Cloth became both symbol and source of inequality. The weaver and the merchant grew rich. The spinner and the shepherd sank deeper into dependence. Yet at the same time, this simple fiber carried Europe toward its first industrial transformation. The water-powered fulling mill, developed in the 12th century, turned human labor into mechanical rhythm. A river no longer just irrigated fields, it beat cloth, day and night, until wool became wealth. Across the continent, guilds arose to control the trade. The weavers of Ghent, the dyers of Florence, the tailors of Paris. Their rules governed quality, price, and even who could learn the craft. The guild was not merely an organization. It was a small republic of artisans, each loyal to the dignity of their trade. But power never remained still. The merchants who financed production began to dictate terms, and cloth became capital. The medieval loom, once a domestic tool, became a cog in a growing economy that reached from the countryside to the city, from peasants' hands to the counting tables of Lombard bankers. Europe was learning to weave profit itself. The colors of tribute. Far across the ocean, in a world untouched by gild or gold coin, Another empire ruled by cloth had reached its zenith. The Inca did not weave for markets, they wove for the state. Every community owed the mita, a tax of labor, and much of that labor was spinning and weaving. From the cold highlands to the warm coasts, women gathered in state workshops called eclahuasi, houses of the chosen women. There they spun llama and vicuña wool into threads so fine that Spanish chroniclers later compared them to silk. Their cloth, called cambay, was reserved for nobles and deities. Colors mattered more than cost. Deep reds and yellows were sacred. Black was the color of earth and night. Patterns spoke a visual language of hierarchy and geography. To wear a particular tunic design was to declare allegiance, not fashion. And unlike Europe, where dyes were guarded trade secrets, Andean color was communal knowledge. Cochineal insects raised on cactus yielded crimson, the mulu shell ground to powder gave pinks and corals, and plant extracts gave greens, blues, and browns. Each region specialized, trading not in finished goods but in ingredients, a decentralized chemistry of beauty. The result was an empire of textiles rather than coin. When the Sapa Inca rewarded a province, he sent bolts of cloth. When he conquered one, he demanded the same. The empire's true treasury was its storehouses of fabric-soft wealth, measured not in metal but in memory and obedience. Thread and faith in Europe. Meanwhile, in medieval Europe, cloth took on its own sacred dimension. Churches were among the largest patrons of textile art. Vestments embroidered with gold thread, altar frontals woven with scenes from scripture, banners carried in processions, all declared divine authority through material splendor. The threads themselves were often spun by women in convents. Cloistered away, they worked for months on a single piece of embroidery. The famous Opus Anglicanum English work adorned the robes of bishops and popes, its stitches so fine they seemed painted rather than sewn. Weaving thus bridged heaven and earth, labor offered as devotion, beauty rendered as theology. The loom became a form of prayer, a way to order chaos into pattern, just as creation itself was believed to have been woven from void. Yet this sacred industry carried contradictions. The same church that condemned vanity depended on luxury textiles for its ceremonies. Gold and silk decorated those who preached humility, while peasants in wool tunics knelt below. Europe's moral fabric was woven as tightly as its cloth. Textiles as communication. In both hemispheres, cloth also served as record. For the Inca, quipu cords knotted in complex patterns functioned as a form of data storage. Each knot represented numbers, and the spacing between them encoded meaning. Though primarily used for accounting, some scholars believe quipu also contained narrative or historical information. If true, then Andean textiles carried language not only in image but in structure. In Europe, illuminated manuscripts often depicted textiles as visual shorthand for identity: a saint's robe, a king's mantle, a beggar's rags. But even beyond symbolism, cloth itself communicated status, allegiance, and piety. To appear before one's lord in rough homespun was to confess poverty. To wear imported silk was to proclaim wealth that needed no words. Cloth was an early form of social media, portable, visible, instantly legible to those who knew how to read it. The meeting of two threads. When the Spanish encountered the empires of the Americas, they recognized at once the value of the textiles they found. Chroniclers like Bernabé Cobo described Inca tunics of such precision that no seam could be seen, no thread out of place. They marveled at the colors, the patterns, the sheer labor behind them. And then they sought to own it. They melted gold but kept cloth. Tribute lists from the early colonial period show that indigenous communities were still required to produce fabric not for gods now, but for European markets. The labor that once bound the empire of the sun now fed the empire of the cross. In return, the Spaniards brought wool, sheep, and the spinning wheel. These tools changed everything. The Andean backstrap loom, slow and meditative, was replaced in many areas by upright European looms that produced more cloth but less meaning. The symmetry of reciprocity weaving for the earth, the ancestors, the community was replaced by the asymmetry of trade. Europe had finally crossed the sea, and its thread had ensnared a new world. A tale of two weavers. It is worth imagining two weavers, one in 14th century Flanders, another in 15th century Cusco. The Flemish weaver works by candlelight, his shuttle knocking rhythmically against the frame. Outside his workshop, the merchant guild waits for his labor, his wages fixed by contract, his product bound for faraway courts. The Cusco weaver sits beneath an open sky. Her backstrap loom ties her to the earth itself. Each pull of the thread tightens not only her cloth but her place in the cosmos. When she finishes, her work will not be sold but given to the temple, to her village, to her lineage. Both are indispensable, both are invisible, both are bound to powers larger than themselves. And both, without knowing it, are part of the same human experiment, the effort to bind chaos into order, to make permanence from the fragile, to turn labor into meaning. Threads of chain. As Europe marched toward the Renaissance, cloth became a symbol of transformation. Silk production spread to southern France and Italy, where artisans guarded their secrets fiercely. Cotton, long imported, began to appear in small quantities, a hint of a future that would one day engulf the world in factories and mills. Meanwhile, in the Americas, European conquest fractured the textile networks that had sustained empires. But not all was lost. Indigenous techniques survived, hidden in villages, remembered by grandmothers, re-emerging in patterns that outlasted their conquerors. The cloth of resistance was woven in silence. Textiles, unlike stone, decay. They leave no monuments, no ruins. Yet in the soil, fibers sometimes endure faint traces of linen in graves, fragments of cotton in desert tombs. Archaeologists lift them gently, threads that outlived the people who made them. And every time, they reveal the same truth. Civilization's most enduring structures are not its walls, but its weavings. So when we speak of progress, of advancement, perhaps we should look not at the sword or the plow, but at the loom. Because while empires fall, the hands that wove them remain echoed in every stitch, every pattern, every piece of fabric that still binds us to the past. In the end, the question remains suspended, like a thread between two looms. Which civilization was more advanced, the one that turned cloth into commerce, or the one that turned it into communion? History tends to remember the loud things, battles, revolutions, discoveries, but the world is held together by the quiet things. A strand of fiber twisted around another, a patient hand tying a knot. By the 16th century, those hands were still at work, but what they made had begun to change. Cloth, which once bound communities and crowned empires, was being rewritten by the forces of conquest, trade, and industrial ambition. The world's looms, once separated by oceans, were beginning to echo the same rhythm. This is the story of that slow unraveling, and of what remained when the threads broke. The colonial loom. The Spanish conquest of the Americas did not just bring swords and crosses, it brought shears and looms. Sheep, unknown in the New World, were introduced to replace the camelids that had fed the Andean textile industry. Within decades, flocks covered the highlands, and wool replaced native fibers. The ancient Ilu system, where textiles were woven as tribute and devotion, became a colonial enterprise. Women who once wove for gods now wove for governors. In Cusco, workshops known as obreges were established by the Spanish crown and private entrepreneurs. They were part factory, part prison, echoing with the steady thump of looms operated by indigenous laborers and enslaved Africans. Spanish overseers recorded bolts of cloth, as if counting ingots of silver. The same tools that had once symbolized cosmic balance now served profit. The Abrage became the dark mirror of the Aclahuasi, where the chosen women of the Inca had woven sacred cloths. The colonized women of the empire now wove under coercion. The skill remained the same delicate fingers, the same ancient knowledge, but its purpose was inverted. Still, in quiet corners of villages untouched by Spanish rule, the old ways survived. Backstrap looms continued to hum. Patterns carried meaning invisible to the colonizers. Diamonds representing mountains, zigzags marking rivers, hidden prayers woven in thread. Resistance was not always rebellion. Sometimes it was simply the refusal to forget. Europe's looms awaken. Meanwhile, across the ocean, Europe's own textile world was undergoing its transformation. In the towns of England, wool merchants grew powerful enough to influence kings. The merchant adventurers based in London exported English cloth to Antwerp and beyond, their fortunes swelling with each bale. But the wool trade, for all its wealth, was slow. Cloth was still handmade, dyed by hand, finished by hand. The future, however, would arrive not through artisans but through engineers. By the late 17th century, experiments with spinning frames and mechanized looms began to emerge. The logic was the same as in the fulling mills of the Middle Ages: replace muscle with motion, human rhythm with mechanical consistency. And so began the chain reaction that would one day be called the Industrial Revolution. When the first spinning machines appeared in England, they were powered by water, not yet by steam. Villages along rivers filled with noise not of conversation or birdsong, but the constant churn of wheels and gears. Cloth was no longer local, it was becoming industrial. The merchant's counting house evolved into a factory ledger. The home loom, once central to the household, was replaced by machines that required scale buildings, capital, discipline, and discipline required rules. Workers, many of them women and children, labored in conditions that blurred day and night. The factory bell replaced the rooster. The rhythm of the shuttle replaced the rhythm of the seasons. Europe had woven itself into something new, efficient, relentless, inhumanly productive. Global threads. As European industry accelerated, its appetite grew insatiable. Cotton, not wool, became the fiber of the future. It was lighter, softer, easier to dye, and could be produced in enormous quantities if one had land, labor, and control. The problem was that cotton did not grow well in Europe. It grew in the warmer climates of India, the Middle East, and eventually the Americas. And so the great cycle of textile colonization began again. From the mills of Manchester to the plantations of the Caribbean, thread connected distant worlds, but the line was uneven. British factories produced cotton cloth using raw materials from India and the American South, the latter grown by enslaved Africans. Indian weavers, whose textiles had once dominated global trade, found their livelihoods crushed by imported British cloth. The quiet skill of the artisan was no match for the speed of the machine. This was the great paradox of progress. The more advanced the looms became, the less visible the weavers were. The forgotten hands. History rarely names the people who actually made things. We know the merchants who built fortunes, the monarchs who taxed exports, the inventors who patented machines. But the spinners, the dyers, the carders, the washers, their names are lost. And yet without them, nothing would have existed. In Europe, entire towns depended on their labor. In Flanders, women spun thread as they walked to market. In England, children picked wool from burrs until their fingers bled. In the Andes, generations of women taught their daughters to twist fibers so evenly that the cloth shimmered in sunlight. Each was part of the same invisible empire, an empire built not on conquest, but on craft. Even today, fragments of their work survive in museum drawers. A piece of brocade, a faded tunic, a woven belt whose colors have outlasted empires. Each one speaks not of kings but of hands. Cloth is memory. As the centuries turned, textile traditions that had once defined civilizations were relegated to folklore. In Europe, machine-made fabric replaced homespun entirely. Weaving, once a family's livelihood, became a hobby. In the Americas, indigenous weavers continued their traditions in defiance of colonial erasure. The backstrap loom became a symbol of endurance. Every thread carried history not in words, but in the motion of its making. In some Andean villages, elders still teach weaving patterns that represent the ancient Chacana, the Andean cross, a bridge between worlds. In every woven design lies a map of survival, of women who kept their culture alive through cloth when temples and languages fell. Meanwhile, in Europe, the industrial fabric industry, now global, had forgotten its origins. What had begun as a sacred craft of texture and patience had become a machine song. And yet, even in the factories, some remnant of reverence remained. Weavers took pride in perfect tension, in the feel of thread between thumb and forefinger. The language of the loom, warp, weft, shuttle survived like liturgy, carrying echoes of a time when weaving was prayer. The threads that bind us. By the 19th century, global trade had fully woven the world together. Bolts of British cloth were traded for African captives. Indian cotton was shipped to Europe and returned as finished garments. Andean alpaca wool became a luxury commodity. The loop was complete, every fiber connected to another, every hand touching another across distance and time. The question of who was more advanced, Europe or the Americas, becomes almost meaningless in this tapestry. Both developed systems of breathtaking complexity, though one measured progress in profit and the other in pattern. In Europe, cloth became an instrument of empire. In the Americas, cloth remained a language of continuity. One sought to master the world, the other sought to mirror it. Perhaps advancement is not measured by technology or output, but by how a society understands the labor of its people, whether it honors the weaver or replaces her. Echoes in the modern age. Today, as you listen, you are likely surrounded by textiles, curtains, sheets, clothing, each a descendant of those early looms. The shirt on your back might trace its fibers to a field in India, its stitching to a factory in Bangladesh, its design to a city in Europe or America. The threads have never stopped moving. We are all part of the same cloth now, though few of us see it. The global textile network is the quiet infrastructure of civilization, invisible, constant, sustaining. And even now, in villages from Peru to the Pyrenees, hands still work the old looms. They weave for tourists, for markets, for memory. Their patterns whisper across time, reminding us that progress has always depended on patience. The final stitch. When the Spanish chroniclers first described the cumbai of the Inca, they compared it to silk, but they missed the point. It was not the fineness that mattered, it was the meaning. When medieval Europe exported its wool, it built cathedrals with the prophets, but it forgot the shepherds. Both worlds sought perfection in thread. Both succeeded and failed in their own ways. And now, as we look back, we can see how those threads, once separate, have become entangled. The looms of power may have shifted, but the weavers remain. Every civilization leaves its mark in stone, in song, and in cloth. The difference is that cloth, fragile as it seems, always finds a way to endure. It survives not in monuments, but in the soft, repetitive motions of hands. Hands that turn chaos into order. Hands that remember, even when the world forgets. You can almost hear it now, the rhythm of the loom, the whisper of thread through thread. It is the sound of history itself, patient, precise, persistent. So perhaps the question is not who was more advanced, but who understood the fabric of life better, the weavers of Europe or the weavers of the Andes. And in that question lies another. What in our own time are we weaving, and for whom? Story 3. The Silent Architects, Roads, Bridges, and the Forgotten Infrastructure of Two Worlds. When people imagine the Middle Ages, they tend to picture castles and cathedrals, grand structures reaching upward toward heaven. When they imagine pre-Columbian America, they picture temples and pyramids, sacred places carved from mountain and jungle alike. But beneath all of these, beneath the monuments and the myths, lay something quieter and far more enduring: the roads. Empires are not truly built by kings or warriors. They are built by roadmakers, the anonymous hands that flatten, pave, and bind the world together. For while the crown may shine in sunlight, the true power of civilization runs underfoot. The European pathways. By the 12th century, Europe's landscape was a patchwork of paths, many tracing their lineage to the Roman Empire. The old Roman roads, via of gravel and stone, were still there in parts, though cracked and overgrown. Medieval pilgrims trudged along them, merchants pushed their carts over them, armies crossed them. Some had become so rutted by centuries of wheels that the grooves carved permanent scars into the earth. Yet much of medieval Europe no longer built like Rome. Roads were not imperial projects but communal or feudal responsibilities. A lord might maintain the stretch of track through his domain, a monastery another, a village yet another. There was no central plan, only necessity. In the damp English countryside, roads often dissolved into mud. In winter, wagons sank to their axles. The word road itself was sometimes too generous. Track or way would have been closer to the truth. But that does not mean Europe was stagnant. These humble routes carried armies, ideas, and goods that reshaped the continent. Pilgrims walked from Canterbury to Santiago de Compostela. Merchants hauled Flemish cloth to the fairs of Champagne. Scholars trudged from Paris to Bologna to learn and teach. Every step they took was on a thread of civilization, thin, imperfect, but vital. Bridges to the heavens. Where roads met rivers, bridges became both obstacles and marvels. Medieval bridge building was an act of communal faith as much as engineering. The Pontifex, the bridge builder, was once a Roman priestly title, later adopted by popes. To build a bridge was to imitate divine creation, to connect what was divided. In the Middle Ages, brotherhoods called pontifices or bridge builders' guilds formed across France, Italy, and Germany. They collected alms to fund stone bridges, often attaching chapels or crosses to sanctify their work. A traveler might kneel in prayer halfway across a river, offering thanks for safe passage. The bridges of Avignon, Cahors, and Prague were triumphs of medieval engineering. They combined pointed Gothic arches with Roman solidity, their foundations often sunk by divers into the riverbed. Each was a promise that trade, faith, and community could overcome nature's divides. Yet maintaining them was another story. Floods, war, and neglect claimed many. In some towns, bridges were rebuilt so many times that they became palimpsests of centuries, a single crossing containing the labor of generations. Every stone was a story. The Andean highways. Across the ocean and high in the spine of South America, another network sprawled, one that rivaled and in many ways surpassed Europe. The Inca road system, or Q-Hapak-Nyan, stretched over 25,000 miles through mountains, deserts, and rainforests. It was not a single highway, but a vast lattice of trails and causeways, meticulously engineered to connect the empire from modern-day Colombia to Chile. Where Europe struggled with mud, the Andes overcame mountains. Stone retaining walls held paths against cliffsides, while steps cut directly into rock allowed travelers to climb vertical slopes. In the highest reaches, roads hugged ridges thousands of feet above sea level, where the air thinned and the world fell away below. These were not roads for wheels. The Inca had no beasts of burden capable of pulling carts. Instead, they were built for feet, human and llama. Messengers known as chasquis ran in relays, carrying messages across the empire faster than any horse could ride in medieval Europe. Suspension bridges made of woven grass spanned gorges hundreds of feet deep. They had to be rebuilt yearly, an act of communal renewal. Villagers would gather, singing and chanting as they twisted fibers into cables, replacing each section of the bridge with ritual precision. These bridges swayed and creaked, but they held. The Inca roads were arteries, not just for trade but for governance. Through them flowed the empire's lifeblood: food, tribute, soldiers, and information. Two visions of order. In both medieval Europe and the Inca world, roads reflected how societies understood themselves. Europe's roads were organic, a patchwork grown over time, reflecting a feudal order: local, decentralized, bound by tradition rather than plan. The Inca roads were deliberate, imperial, geometric. Every segment was mapped, measured, and maintained by labor tax. The Inca used the mita, a system of communal service, to build and repair their infrastructure. Each village contributed workers, food, and materials. It was not merely labor but loyalty, woven into the empire's structure. In Europe, labor obligations also existed: serfs repairing roads or clearing paths as part of their feudal duties. But without central coordination, roads decayed as quickly as they were built. The difference lay in purpose. In Europe, roads connected towns and trade fairs. In the Andes, they connected altars and administrative centers. One was economic, the other spiritual. And yet in both worlds, the people who maintained these paths, peasants, masons, runners, shared the same anonymity. Their names did not survive, only their work beneath our feet. Travelers in time. Imagine traveling both worlds in the same century, say, the early 1400s. You, a merchant or pilgrim, leave Bruges, crossing muddy roads lined with hedgerows. It takes days to cover 20 miles, your cart stuck in the mire. Each village you pass demands tolls, each bridge a fee. The air smells of wet wool and smoke. Then imagine standing in the Andes, walking a clean stone path that rises above clouds. You carry a small pack, stepping lightly with llamas beside you. In the distance, a Tambos and Inca way station offers rest, food, and shelter. You are part of a network that stretches across continents. The air is cold, clear, silent except for your breath and the mountain wind. Two worlds, two roads. One slow, communal, rooted in trade. The other swift, imperial, rooted in unity. Neither could imagine the other, yet both, in their own way, represented mastery over landscape. The hidden architects. Roads and bridges were rarely built by nobles or kings. They were made by craftsmen whose names never entered chronicles. In medieval Europe, bridge builders and stonemasons formed their own guilds, precursors to modern engineers. They shared secret knowledge of geometry and load-bearing arches, a lineage that would one day lead to Gothic cathedrals and, centuries later, modern bridges of iron and steel. In the Andes, the architects of the Qiuhapacnian understood the land intimately. They read the terrain like a manuscript, knowing where frost gathered, where landslides threatened, where water could be channeled. Without wheels or iron tools, they built with astonishing precision, aligning roads with celestial markers and sacred peaks. To this day, archaeologists struggle to trace their full network. Many paths still exist, overgrown but walkable. Some are still used by herders and pilgrims, the stones smoothed by centuries of feet. In both worlds, the builders left no signatures. Their anonymity was their immortality. The cost of connection. Roads connect, but they also control. The Inca roads allowed the state to move armies swiftly, to extract tribute efficiently. They were lines of communication and domination. Likewise, in Europe, roads served the powerful as much as the poor. Lords collected tolls, monarchs used roads to deploy troops, and pilgrims paid for safe passage. Connection always comes with cost. But the quiet miracle of infrastructure is that, over time, it stops belonging to the powerful and becomes the property of everyone. The same road that carried the king's army one year might carry a peasant's cart the next, a scholar's manuscript, a lover's letter, a monk's prayer. Every footstep wears down the authority of those who built the path until only the road remains. The world of the Middle Ages and that of the Inca Empire never met on equal terms. When Spanish conquistadors first followed the Quijapac-Ñan, they were astonished. Some compared it to the Roman roads, others said it was better. Yet in that comparison lies an irony. Two great road systems separated by oceans and time, both fading just as Europe was learning to rebuild its own. It makes you wonder if the world had turned differently. If the Inca roads had become global trade routes instead of relics, what kind of modernity might we have inherited? The stones still whisper beneath the earth. Every path walked, every bridge crossed, is an echo of those ancient builders, Europe's muddy pilgrims and the Andes' skybound engineers. The roads they built were the bones of their empires. And long after the flesh of kingdoms rotted away, those bones endured. When you walk along an old road, you are never truly alone. Every footstep joins those of 1,000 others who came before pilgrims, soldiers, messengers, traders, shepherds, and wanderers, each one moving for reasons that in the end all sound the same: hunger, faith, duty, curiosity. The road, whether in medieval Europe or the mountains of the Andes, was not merely a way to travel, it was a way to think. A civilization's roads tell you how it saw itself and what it believed worth connecting. The Pilgrim's Way, Europe's spiritual highways. In medieval Europe, to set foot on the road was often an act of devotion. Pilgrimage to Rome, to Jerusalem, to Santiago de Compostela became both ritual and ordeal. The act of walking itself was penance, a means of cleansing sin through motion. Pilgrims wore simple cloaks and carried badges shaped like scallop shells or crosses. They followed the ancient Roman routes that still linked towns and abbeys, guided by shrines, monasteries, and the kindness of strangers. The road was dangerous wolves, bandits, sickness, but it was also holy ground. Every mile was a prayer. Along these routes, new settlements emerged. Inns, hospitals, and bridges were built by religious orders like the Knights Hospitaller or the Brothers of the Bridge. In Spain, Hermandad's brotherhoods of travelers formed to protect pilgrims from theft and guide them safely. Europe's road system was thus more than infrastructure. It was a network of faith. Where Rome had built to conquer, the Church rebuilt to redeem. By the 13th century, the Camino de Santiago stretched across Western Europe like a web of devotion. Towns competed to host relics, hopping to attract pilgrims and their coin. Trade followed faith, as it always does. Inns grew into markets and markets into cities. The road to heaven, it turned out, was paved with commerce. Roads of the Sun, the Inca's sacred geography. In the Inca world, the idea of the road was equally sacred, but its orientation was different. If European roads led outward toward holy cities, the Inca roads led inward, binding the empire into a single cosmic body. The Quijapac-Ñan was not just an engineering feat, it was a spiritual axis. Each major route radiated from Cusco, the navel of the world, where the Sapa Inca ruled as the living child of the sun. From that center, roads reached toward the four sayas, the quarters of the empire, each associated with a direction, a people, and a set of deities. Walking these roads was a sacred act. Travelers moved not just through geography, but through layers of meaning from the realm of humans to that of ancestors, mountains, and gods. The Inca believed that every road had its guardian spirit. Before journeys, offerings were made. Chicha beer poured on the ground, coca leaves scattered for luck. Waystations called tambos were placed at regular intervals, small complexes where runners rested and officials stored supplies. To stay in one was to participate in the order of the empire, an order that stretched from the Pacific coast to the peaks of the Andes. Where European roads were public and varied in quality, the Inca roads were carefully stratified. Some were reserved for state use, others for common travel. Certain sections, especially those leading to sacred shrines, were swept daily by attendants so that the feet of the Inca would never touch dust. It was not merely infrastructure, it was liturgy. Messages in motion. Both Europe and the Andes understood that roads were power not just physical, but informational. In Europe, royal messengers carried sealed letters along dangerous routes, often changing horses at abbeys or posting stations. Communication was slow, fragile. A single storm could delay messages for weeks. In contrast, the Inca achieved remarkable speed without wheels, iron, or beasts of burden. Their chasqui runners formed a human relay system, stationed every few miles along the Quhapac-Nyan. One runner would see another approaching from the distance and blow a conch shell to signal readiness. The first runner, panting from altitude, would pass a message, sometimes a verbal report, other times a nodded quipu to the next. Then he would rest, and the message would continue. A message could travel 150 miles in a single day, faster than any communication in Europe, until the invention of the telegraph. This efficiency allowed the Inca to coordinate food supplies, mobilize armies, and transmit imperial decrees across impossible terrain. In their own way, the chasquis were the fiber-optic cables of the 15th century, a living network of speed and precision. Bridges between worlds. In both hemispheres, bridges were miracles of their age. Europe's stone bridges were often celebrated in chronicles and songs. The bridge at Avignon became so famous it inspired a children's rhyme. These structures, built by religious brotherhoods or civic guilds, were expressions of charity, literal acts of bridging the gap. But in the Andes, bridges took on a deeper, almost mythic quality. Without iron or mortar, the Inca wove bridges from grass Quetzalcoatl, renewing them annually through communal ceremony. Entire villages gathered to twist thick ropes from iku grass, singing to keep rhythm. The old bridge was cut down only after the new one was complete. Crossing such a bridge was a test of faith. The structure swayed, creaked, and moaned underfoot, yet it held as it always had. To walk across was to trust in one's neighbors, to believe that the world, however fragile, could hold together through cooperation. These bridges were living metaphors for the Inca Empire itself, tension and balance sustained by collective labor. Even today, descendants of those same villagers in Huancaire, Peru, still rebuild the Quetzalcoatl Bridge every June, as they have for more than 500 years. The ritual continues, the last surviving bridge of the Inca road system, still woven by hand. Maintenance and memory. In both Europe and the Andes, maintenance was the measure of civilization. A road unkept was a road undone. Medieval Europe's chronic neglect often reflected its fractured politics. Kings issued decrees demanding upkeep, but power rarely extended beyond the next valley. Bridges collapsed and were left in ruin, trade detoured, and towns withered. In contrast, the Inca enforced strict maintenance through their labor system. Villages along each section were responsible for repairs, and failure to fulfill that duty could bring punishment. The empire's communication and survival depended on diligence and on the communal will to keep it running. When Spanish chroniclers first traversed these roads, they were astonished by their condition. Even decades after the fall of the empire, the paths remained intact, polished by centuries of feet. They found no ruts, no mud, no chaos, only precision. Europe's travelers, used to losing wheels in the mire, must have felt as if they had stepped onto another planet. The fragile unity. Every empire dreams of unity. Roads make that dream seem real for a time. The Incas' network allowed them to move troops quickly and enforce authority across impossible distances. But that same network became the Spaniards' greatest advantage. Once Pizarro's forces captured Cusco, the Quiapac carried their conquest outward like veins carrying infection. In Europe, the revival of roads in the later Middle Ages made possible the spread of trade and of plague. When the Black Death struck in the mid-14th century, it traveled not on isolated ships, but along the continent's busiest routes. What had once been the arteries of prosperity became the channels of contagion. The road does not choose what it carries. The philosophy of the path. To walk the medieval road or the Andean trail was to encounter a microcosm of one's world. For the European pilgrim, the journey tested faith through hardship. For the Andean runner, it affirmed cosmic balance through movement. Both saw travel as transformation not simply of place, but of spirit. Perhaps that is why both cultures treated roads with reverence. They were not inert stone or dirt, but vessels of intention. To repair a bridge, to sweep a path, to rebuild a span, these were moral acts, acts that said, "We remain connected." Echoes in the landscape. If you walk through Europe today, you can still find traces of the medieval ways, narrow lanes between hedgerows, Roman stones embedded beneath asphalt. Some bridges still bear the grooves of ancient carts. In the Andes, the Quiapac remains, winding through valleys and cloud forests. Llamas still tread its stones. The old tambos lie in ruins, but their alignment still guides travelers. The road survives because it serves both memory and need. To stand on one of these roads, whether the mossy stones of France or the high passes of Peru, is to feel the hum of continuity. The same wind that carried medieval prayers carries Andean dust. And somewhere unseen, the ghosts of builders still walk beside you, checking the edges, tightening the ropes, keeping the world intact. But every road leads somewhere. And in the next turn of history, both Europe and the Americas would see their networks transformed not by hands of faith, but by hands of conquest and profit. For when the old empires fell, the roads remained and others learned how to use them. The old roads never truly end. Even when grass grows over them and maps forget their names, they linger beneath the surface not just as buried stones, but as ideas about connection, obligation, and endurance. Both medieval Europe and pre-Columbian America built networks of astonishing resilience, yet their fates could not have been more different. One decayed slowly, rediscovered only by modern nation-states. The other was shattered almost overnight, repurposed by conquerors, its spirit buried beneath new rulers' ambitions. Still in the quiet, both endured. The Inca roads under Spanish boots. When the Spanish arrived in the Andes in the early 1500s, they were awed and perplexed by what they found. Chroniclers like Pedro Cieza de Leon marveled at the perfection of the Inca highways. Straight lines across mountains, precise drainage, and causeways so smooth they rivaled the best Roman works. But the conquistadors did not come to admire, they came to use. The Quiapac became the skeleton of a new colonial order. The same tambos that once housed runners and imperial administrators were turned into repartimiento stations, waypoints for Spanish officials and soldiers. The relay system of chasquis was dismantled, deemed unnecessary and pagan. Horses and mules replaced runners, and roads meant for bare feet and llamas were widened and cut. The Inca infrastructure, built for harmony and balance, was reshaped into an instrument of extraction. Silver caravans now moved where food and messages once flowed. The road from Potosi to Lima, for example, became one of the busiest arteries in the world, carrying wealth from the mines of Bolivia to the ships of Spain. It was a different kind of order, no longer spiritual or communal, but economic and coercive. Yet even through forced labor, the old knowledge persisted. The indigenous Mideos who maintained the roads under colonial rule used the same techniques as their ancestors, the same stones, the same rituals whispered under breath, even when forbidden. Each repair, each bridge mended, was an act of both obedience and quiet defiance. The Q-Hapak Nyan survived conquest not because it was indestructible, but because the people who built it refused to let it die. Europe's uneven renaissance. Meanwhile, in Europe, the roads that had once carried pilgrims and merchants were being reborn, but unevenly, and for new reasons. By the 15th and 16th centuries, the feudal world was giving way to centralized kingdoms. Kings and princes began to see that control of roads meant control of revenue, armies, and communication. France under Louis XI and England under Henry VIII began investing in major royal highways, setting the stage for the postal systems that would connect Europe's capitals. Yet much of the continent remained stuck in mud. Outside royal domains, road maintenance was local, often neglected, always underfunded. Travelers in the 17th century still complained of ruts deep enough to swallow carts, bridges in disrepair, and roads impassable in winter. In England, turnpike trusts arose, private groups authorized to charge tolls for road repair. The roads improved, but only where profit justified it. Pilgrimage routes faded, replaced by commerce routes and colonial ambition. Where once monks built bridges for salvation, merchants now built them for convenience. The road's purpose had changed, even if its stones were the same. The Age of Iron and Empire. The 18th and 19th centuries brought a second revolution of roads, one powered by iron, steam, and empire. In Europe, macadamized roads, compacted layers of crushed stone developed by John McAdam, replaced mud tracks, allowing carriages to move faster and farther. Stagecoaches, post routes, and trade convoys redefined mobility. For the first time in centuries, the entire continent began to knit itself together. But the transformation came with a cost. The old walking paths, the pilgrims' ways, the quiet medieval routes, they were abandoned or paved over. The intimacy of travel, the human pace, was lost. The road became a machine, not a companion. In the Americas, the same logic of empire extended through the Andes. The Spanish, and later the Republican governments that followed, continued to use and expand the Q-Hapak Nyan, now for railways, mining routes, and military campaigns. The road's sacred geometry was erased, replaced by grids, property lines, and maps drawn in foreign languages. By the 19th century, the Incas' careful balance between human and environment, the art of building with the mountain, had been forgotten in favor of cutting through it. Forgotten roads, remembered people. And yet, even as empires rose and fell, people remembered. In Europe, villagers still used the old pilgrimage paths, sometimes unknowingly. The Camino de Santiago, nearly forgotten by the 19th century, was revived in the late 20th as both spiritual and touristic phenomenon. Modern pilgrims still walk those same routes, their feet falling on stones once worn smooth by monks and merchants 1,000 years ago. In the Andes, the old roads were never truly abandoned. Farmers still led their llamas along stone paths built before Columbus. Children played near the ruins of tambos, unaware they were standing where emperors once sent their messages. When archaeologists in the 20th century began to map the Q-Hapak Nyan, they found that many sections were still in use not as monuments, but as living infrastructure. In 2014, UNESCO declared the Inca road system a World Heritage Site. Yet for many Andean villagers, it had never been anything else. It was simply the path home, the philosophy beneath the stones. If you look closely at the history of roads, you begin to see a quiet philosophy running beneath them, a shared understanding of what it means to move and connect. For both the medieval European and the Inca builder, the road was not a conquest of nature, but a negotiation with it. They curved around hills, followed rivers, climbed passes slowly and deliberately. Their purpose was endurance, not speed. Modern roads, by contrast, seek to dominate the landscape, to flatten, to tunnel, to erase the obstacle. The ancients walked with the land, we drive against it. Yet their older ways endure precisely because they were designed to last. A Roman road can still bear weight after 2 millennia. An Inca bridge, woven from grass, is renewed every year through communal ritual. Perhaps the lesson lies there. Permanence is not in stone but in practice. The builders we forget. Who were these builders? Not emperors, not priests, but ordinary hands. The mason laying stones on a bridge near Cluny, France, praying under his breath as he works. The Andean woman twisting iku grass into rope, her laughter echoing through the valley. The monk keeping records of tolls, writing by candlelight. The Midjo laborer repairing a section of road he would never travel freely. Their names are gone, but their work remains. Every smooth curve in a road, every notch in a bridge beam, was a decision and a story. 1,000 small choices made by people who knew the world was bigger than themselves, but still worth tending. To maintain a road was, in its way, an act of faith in continuity, in return, in the idea that someone else would pass this way tomorrow. Echoes of 2 civilizations. When you place a map of the medieval European road network beside one of the Q-Hapak-Nyan, the resemblance is uncanny. Both radiate from spiritual centers, Rome or Santiago in one, Cusco in the other. Both branch out like veins, connecting highlands, valleys, and seas. Both depended on cooperation more than force, and both expressed a worldview in which movement was sacred. Europe and the Andes were never meant to meet, and yet their roads followed the same logic, a logic older than empires. That life is motion. That connection requires care. That every path, however humble, leads to meaning if walked with intention. The road today. If you stand today on a mountain trail in Peru or a country lane in France, you might hear the same sound. Wind moving through grass, footsteps echoing faintly, the creak of a bridge underfoot. Modern highways roar with engines, but in quiet places, the old roads wait. They are not lost, only sleeping. The Q-Hapak-Nyan still threads through the Andes like a scar of memory, a living artifact of human will. The Camino still winds through fields and forests, carrying those who seek something older than convenience. These paths remind us that civilization is not measured by speed or size, but by care, by the willingness to maintain, repair, and walk again. A final reflection. The roads of medieval Europe and pre-Columbian America were built for different gods, different purposes, different worlds. Yet both carried the same unspoken promise, that distance could be overcome by effort, that the unknown could be made known through persistence. Their stones may crumble, their bridges may fall, but the idea they carried of movement, of connection endures. Because in the end, a road is never just a way from one place to another. It is the space between where human intention meets the earth, where purpose meets endurance. And somewhere between the dust of the Q-Hapak-Nyan and the cobbles of the Camino, you can still hear them. The builders, the walkers, the ones who kept the world stitched together, one stone at a time. The silent architects are gone, but their roads remain whispering beneath our feet. Story 4, Fields of Faith, Agriculture and Ritual in Two Worlds. When people in the Middle Ages looked at a field of grain, they didn't see just food. They saw the hinge between heaven and earth, a fragile golden link upon which life, faith, and fear all depended. Across the ocean, in the high valleys of the Andes or the lush lands of Mesoamerica, another kind of reverence guided the same work. There too, the act of planting was an act of worship. The first furrow cut into the soil was both practical and spiritual, the opening line of a dialogue with gods who might, if pleased, send rain or, if angered, send ruin. In both worlds, To feed the people meant to feed the divine. The European fields, labor and litany. In medieval Europe, agriculture was the great constant. Empires fell, kings rose and vanished, wars came and went, but the rhythm of the field endured a pattern as sure as sunrise and frost. The medieval peasant's life revolved around it. Every season had its tasks, its tools, its dangers. Spring brought plowing and sowing, summer the back-breaking harvest, autumn thrashing and storage, winter repair and prayer. In the cold north, heavy soils demanded innovation. The heavy plow, drawn by oxen or horses, cut deep into the ground and turned it richly. The shift from the Roman scratch plow to the iron-tipped moldboard was one of the quiet revolutions of medieval Europe. It allowed more food, larger villages, and ultimately the rebirth of cities. But technology alone could not guarantee survival. Weather ruled all. Too much rain and the grain would rot, too little and the stalks would wither. A late frost could undo a year's labor overnight. So the medieval farmer prayed. Every village had its blessings of the field's processions with banners and relics, priests sprinkling holy water over furrows, chants that mingled fear with hope. The church absorbed older, pagan rites into its own calendar. The rogation days, for instance, when fields were circled in prayer to protect the growing crops. Behind the liturgy lay anxiety. Famine was never far. The 14th century saw harvest failures so severe that entire regions starved. Between 1315 and 1317, rains ruined crops across northern Europe. Chronicles tell of people eating bark, cats, even corpses. The famine killed perhaps 1 in 10, a quieter catastrophe than plague, but one that left deeper scars. To farm in medieval Europe was not just to work, it was to bargain with the divine, season after season. The Andean fields, labor as worship. High above the clouds, the farmers of the Inca world worked under a different sky, but under the same sacred pressure. Here the gods were many: sun, moon, thunder, earth, but none more important than Inti, the sun god, whose warmth ripened the maize and whose favor sustained the state. To the Inca, the soil was alive. The earth herself, Pachamama, was both mother and eater, generous when honored, cruel when neglected. Before planting, farmers offered coca leaves, chicha beer, or llama fat to the ground. Feed the mother, they said, and she will feed you. Agriculture here was an art of adaptation. The Andes, with their steep slopes and erratic climate, offered no easy field. Yet through terraces, irrigation canals, and communal labor, the Inca made the mountains bloom. Terracing transformed vertical space into horizontal abundance. Each level captured soil and moisture, allowing maize, potatoes, and quinoa to grow where nothing else should. Stone retaining walls moderated temperature swings. Water channels caught melt from glaciers. This was engineering of the most patient kind, centuries of trial and observation, encoded in landscape. The Andean farmer, like his European counterpart, trusted both ritual and reason. At sowing time, priests consulted the stars. The appearance of the Pleiades in the June sky told whether rains would be early or late. If the stars shone clear, the season would be good. If dim, clouded by invisible dust or moisture, it was an omen of drought. Their agricultural calendar was written not in books, but in constellations and shadows. The collective and the crop. In Europe, land was divided between lord and peasant, between church and crown. In the Andes, it was shared. The Inca divided each community's fields into 3 parts, one for the state, one for the gods, and one for the people. Labor for each was mandatory, but in return, the empire guaranteed survival. If one valley's harvest failed, food from another was sent through the storehouses that lined the imperial roads. The system was not purely generous, it was control through sustenance. Still, it worked. No one starved while granaries were full. In Europe, famine was a local affair, each village's tragedy its own. Lords might hoard grain, merchants might raise prices. The church urged charity, but distribution was haphazard, and hunger spread faster than relief. The difference was philosophical as much as logistical. In the Andes, food was sacred property. In Europe, it was economic property. And yet both treated agriculture as a mirror of divine will. A poor harvest meant not just hunger, but moral failure. Somewhere, someone had sinned. Festivals of fertility. If the work was exhausting, the celebrations were ecstatic. In Europe, harvest festivals marked the turning of the year. The first sheaf of grain was brought to the church and blessed, a symbol of gratitude and endurance. Ale flowed, songs rose. For a few days, the peasants who labored for others could revel in what their own hands had made. In the Andes, harvest festivals were even more spectacular. During Inti Raymi, the festival of the sun, thousands gathered in Cusco to honor Inti. Offerings of maize beer and roasted guinea pigs were made. Dancers in feathered costumes reenacted the cosmic balance between earth and sky. Both ceremonies affirmed a single truth. Survival depended on cooperation, not just among people, but between people and gods. And both masked beneath their joy the same fragile truth, that abundance could vanish with a single bad season. Tools and techniques, the quiet innovations. The medieval farmer's toolkit was simple but ingenious. The heavy plow, the horse collar, the three-field system, each innovation, small in itself, multiplied productivity across centuries. By alternating crops, one with grain, one with legumes, and one left fallow, the soil renewed itself. It was slow science, learned through failure, passed from hand to hand. In the Andes, the tools were equally modest. The chaquitacla, a foot plow of wood and bronze, allowed farmers to cut through soil on steep slopes without beasts of burden. Women sowed seed from small baskets, pressing them into earth with their feet, a choreography of survival. In both worlds, progress was not the work of geniuses, but of generations. Faith in the furrow. There is something profoundly humbling about agriculture in both civilizations. For all their different gods, languages, and technologies, both the European and the Andean farmer lived by faith, not abstract faith, but faith grounded in earth and sky. When the soil cracked under drought, both turned to prayer. When blight or frost came, both sought meaning in stars or sermons. When harvests were good, both thanked forces beyond themselves. Their rituals, though worlds apart, spoke the same language, gratitude and fear. Because to live close to the soil is to live close to limits. And every seed sown is a small act of trust that the world will hold its promise one more year. In the next part of this story, we'll walk deeper into those fields to see how power, hierarchy, and belief turn the harvest into politics, and food into faith itself. Because the story of agriculture is not just about survival, it's about control of nature, of labor, and of the spirit. When we think of kings and empires, we imagine crowns, battles, and banners, but not the soil. And yet beneath every throne lies a field. Every kingdom, every temple, every stone city stands on the quiet, unseen labor of those who planted, weeded, and reaped. In both medieval Europe and the empires of pre-Columbian America, food was the first and last measure of power. To control the harvest was to control the people. And to feed the gods was to justify doing so. The lord's grain and the peasant's hunger. In medieval Europe, the social order was written in furrows. The manorial system, that sprawling network of estates, villages, and tenants, organized land into two great categories: the lord's domain and the peasant's strips. The lord's fields were cultivated first. Peasants owed labor, rent, days of work using their own hands, tools, and beasts, not for themselves, but for the manor. Only afterward could they tend their own plots, often small and scattered. The harvest determined more than a year's fortune. It set the rhythm of obligation, taxation, and survival. Tithes went to the church a tenth of grain, hay, or livestock. Taxes went to the crown. The rest, if any, sustained the household through winter. Grain was not just food, it was currency. It paid for rent, dowries, debts, and bribes. When a harvest failed, the system cracked, but the Lord's demands did not lessen. Famine, then, was not merely natural, it was political. During the Great Famine of 1315–1317, while thousands starved, monasteries and noble granaries overflowed. Many sold grain at inflated prices, even as peasants collapsed on the roadsides. Some chroniclers recorded people eating the seed meant for spring, a desperate act that doomed the following year. And yet, the church called such suffering a test of faith, God's punishment, or purification. The farmer might kneel in prayer, but the real gods of the field were the ones who owned it. Grain God in the crown. Even kings bowed to the harvest. Medieval monarchs maintained vast estates, but their power depended on grain flow, especially to armies and cities. When the harvest failed, unrest followed. Bread riots in late medieval France and England were not random. They were political tremors of hunger. In some regions, the crown intervened to regulate prices or transport, but roads were poor, granaries small, and corruption common. The dream of a centralized, stable food system remained just that, a dream. The irony was that Europe's most powerful institution, the church, held immense agricultural wealth. Monasteries were major landowners, their cloisters surrounded by fertile fields and vineyards. Cistercian monks in particular became expert farmers, draining marshes, introducing watermills, and breeding hardy cattle. Their fields, orderly and productive, reflected a theology of labor as prayer. But even this piety had limits. The wealth that flowed from those fields funded cathedrals and crusades, not hungry mouths. For all its sanctity, medieval agriculture remained bound by inequality. The Inca's golden fields. In the Inca world, agriculture was also the foundation of state, but the system worked differently. Here, the ruler claimed not personal ownership, but stewardship of the land. All land belonged, ultimately, to the sun and by extension, to his divine son, the Sapa Inca. Each village, or ilu, cultivated three kinds of fields. One for the gods and rituals, one for the state and the army, one for the community itself. This division ensured that divine, imperial, and human needs were met in balance, at least in theory. At harvest time, work began with the sacred plots. Priests led ceremonies to honor Inti, pouring chicha beer into the soil before the first sheaves were cut. Only after these divine fields were tended could the rest of the community begin. Labor, too, was a sacred duty. Through the Midas system, every able-bodied person owed a portion of time to public work, farming, road repair, or storage. In return, the state provided food from its granaries in times of need. The logic was both moral and practical. The empire functioned as a single organism, one arm laboring while another rested, one valley feeding another. And the storage system, the kulkaz, was astonishing. Vast stone granaries lined mountain roads, carefully ventilated to preserve maize and dried potatoes, chuño, for years. Archaeologists estimate that some regions held enough surplus to feed entire provinces through famine. No European kingdom of the time could claim such preparation. Feasts and sacrifices. Both continents ritualized abundance. In Europe, the harvest feast, whether Lammas in England or the Fête des Moissons in France, marked a brief reversal of hierarchy. For one night, peasants ate their fill. Laughter replaced labor, and the Lord might even sit among them. The grain itself had symbolic life. In England, the last sheaf was dressed in ribbons, sometimes called the Corn Mother or harvest queen. She was kept until spring, ensuring fertility for the next season, a quiet echo of older pagan goddesses like Demeter or Ceres, still alive beneath Christian blessing. In the Andes, the symbolism was even more literal. The Sapa Inca himself took part in harvest rituals. At the great festival of Inti Raymi, he would plow the first furrow using a golden implement, watched by thousands. The act was theatrical but profound, the divine king joining the people in their most essential labor. Afterward came sacrifice. Llamas, guinea pigs, and sometimes humans were offered to guarantee the next year's fertility. Such acts seem brutal now, but to the Inca, they were exchanges of life force, a repayment to the earth that gave everything. Where Europe offered prayer, the Andes offered blood. Yet both believed they were giving back what had been lent. Food as faith, faith as power. The connection between religion and food production ran deep. In both worlds, priests and rulers claimed to mediate between heaven and harvest. When the rains failed, it was not merely a natural disaster, it was a failure of ritual, a lapse of devotion. In medieval Europe, priests held processions through parched villages, holding relics of saints who had once brought rain. In the Andes, Pacos, holy men, performed dispatches, ritual offerings burned or buried to appease the mountain spirits Apis. Every culture framed hunger as communication, a message from gods to mortals. And every response, from fasting to feast, from tithe to sacrifice, was an attempt to speak back. Grain and empire. It is easy to forget how political a loaf of bread can be. Grain made armies move, cities grow, and rulers rule. In Europe, monasteries and towns grew wealthy through control of mills and markets. In the Andes, the Inca Empire extended itself through food redistribution. In both cases, food was not just nourishment, it was a network. The Quilcas were both storehouses and symbols. To fill them was to prove loyalty, to empty them was to sustain empire. Likewise, the granaries of abbeys and castles represented stability, the ability to weather scarcity when others could not. And when those systems broke, when the grain ran out, or was hoarded, rebellion followed. In 1480, Andean farmers rose against local Curacas chiefs, who demanded tribute during a drought. In 1320, English peasants rioted after years of poor harvests, demanding bread and truth. Hunger levels all hierarchies, if only briefly. The silent revolt of the soil. The most patient rebel in history is the earth itself. Overuse, exhaustion, and greed degrade it slowly, invisibly, until one day it refuses to yield. Europe's fields, after centuries of continuous cultivation, began to thin by the late Middle Ages. Forests fell to plows, soil eroded, yields declined. The peasants blamed sin, priests blamed pride. Few realized it was simply the land asking for rest. In the Andes, the terrace systems protected against such decline, at least until Spanish colonization. The forced labor demands of the new rulers ignored local ecological balance. Fields once carefully rotated were overworked, terraces collapsed, canals silted. The land grew tired here too. Whether under feudal lord or viceroy, the earth bore the weight of human ambition. The harvest, in the end, was never just about survival. It was a mirror reflecting each civilization's structure, its faith, and its failures. For both Europe and the Andes, the question was never simply, will the crops grow? It was, who deserves to eat? In the next section, we'll see how this fragile balance between faith and famine, ritual and ruin began to unravel. For no field, however fertile, can withstand the plow of conquest forever. There are moments in history when the land itself seems to pause. The plow stands idle, the granary door hangs open, empty. The songs that once marked sowing and harvest fade into memory. For both medieval Europe and pre-Columbian America, Those moments came not gradually, but violently through conquest, disease, climate, and the slow unraveling of belief. The fields did not stop producing overnight, but the systems that gave them meaning did. And when agriculture loses its ritual, its balance, and its caretakers, the consequences echo for centuries. The breaking of the Andean world. When Spanish conquistadors entered the Andes, they did not just conquer cities and kings. They dismantled a living agricultural system, one that had taken centuries to refine. The Mita, once a reciprocal labor system, became forced servitude. Indigenous farmers were torn from their fields and sent to mines like Potosi, where silver flowed but life did not. Terraces went untended, canals clogged with sediment, seed knowledge passed through generations was interrupted. The Inca calendar, once aligned with stars and seasons, was declared pagan. Festivals were banned, rituals suppressed, shrines destroyed. Without ceremony, agriculture became mechanical labor without meaning. Spanish livestock, unfamiliar to the Andes, trampled terraces and compacted soil. European crops replaced native varieties, often poorly suited to altitude. The delicate balance between mountain, climate, and cultivation began to fail. Worst of all came disease. Smallpox, measles, and influenza swept through Andean communities before many had ever seen a Spaniard. Farmers died in the fields, entire villages vanished. Granaries stood full, while no one remained to open them. The earth had not failed the people. The people had been removed from the earth. Europe's slow collapse and rebirth. In medieval Europe, the unraveling was slower but no less profound. The Black Death of the mid-14th century killed perhaps 1/3 to 1/2 of the population. Fields lay fallow not by design, but by absence. For the first time in centuries, land outnumbered laborers. Serfs fled estates, wages rose, lords struggled to maintain control. Ironically, the plague gave the soil a chance to rest. Forests reclaimed abandoned fields, wildlife returned. Grain yields, when cultivation resumed, improved in some regions. But the spiritual meaning of agriculture shifted. God's wrath had seemed arbitrary, rituals had failed. Faith, though not lost, became more private, more uncertain. The peasant who once saw every harvest as divine dialogue now began to see it as negotiation with landlords, markets, and emerging states. By the early modern period, agriculture was no longer primarily sacred. It was economic. The end of ritual time. In both worlds, conquest and catastrophe broke what anthropologists call ritual time, the cyclical understanding of life. In the Andes, planting had mirrored the heavens. In Europe, the liturgical calendar had mirrored the seasons. But after disruption, time became linear. Progress replaced renewal. Production replaced balance. The field was no longer a sacred space. It became a resource. This shift did not happen overnight, nor was it consciously chosen. It emerged from necessity, survival, and loss. A farmer who has buried children does not consult the stars. He plants when he can. Survival's beneath the surface. Yet nothing truly disappears. In the Andes, indigenous farmers quietly preserved ancient crops: potatoes, maize, quinoa, and terrace techniques. Rituals returned in disguise, folded into Christian festivals. Pachamama became a saint in all but name. In Europe, folk traditions survived beneath the church's surface. Harvest queens, blessing of fields, maypoles, echoes of older agricultural faiths persisted well into the modern age. The soil remembers, and so do people. What remains today? Modern agriculture, mechanized, global, abstract, bears little resemblance to medieval fields or Andean terraces. Yet the questions are the same. Who controls the land? Who eats? What happens when balance is lost? The Inca terraces now inspire sustainable farming movements. Medieval crop rotation informs modern soil science. What was once ritual has become data, but the stakes remain unchanged. A quiet ending. If you walk today through an abandoned terrace in Peru or a hedged field in rural France, you may feel it. The sense that something patient once lived here. Hands shaped this land with care. Prayers were spoken. Seeds were trusted to darkness. Civilizations rose on that trust. They fell when it was broken. And still, every spring, someone plants again. Reflection. Medieval Europe and pre-Columbian America did not ask whether they were advanced. They asked whether the earth would answer them one more year. In that question lies their deepest wisdom and their shared humanity. Story 5. Cities of Stone and Straw, Urban Life in Two Worlds. When you hear the word city, a certain image likely comes to mind. Crowded streets, stone walls, towers, markets, noise, and smells layered upon one another. For medieval Europe, this image would not be far from the truth. For pre-Columbian America, however, the city followed a different logic, one that confounds modern expectations and quietly challenges long-held assumptions about what advanced urban life really meant. To understand which world was more advanced, you must first set aside modern definitions and walk slowly, carefully, through their streets, not as a conqueror or tourist, but as someone who lives there. The European city, walls, rights, and density. In medieval Europe, a city was not defined by size alone. It was defined by privilege. A true city possessed a charter, a legal document granting rights from a king, bishop, or lord. These rights allowed residents to hold markets, govern themselves to a degree, and most importantly, live free from certain feudal obligations. This is why a medieval saying declared, "City air makes you free." Cities were magnets. Escaped serfs fled to them. Merchants clustered inside their walls. Craftsmen organized into guilds. Scholars gathered near cathedrals and universities. Physically, European cities were dense and defensive. Stone walls encircled them like clenched fists. Gates closed at night. Towers loomed overhead. Inside, space was precious. Houses rose vertically, with shops on the ground floor and families stacked above. Streets were narrow, dark, and loud, built for feet, not carts. Sanitation was minimal. Waste flowed through open gutters. Animals wandered freely. And yet life pulsed with energy. Bells marked time for prayer, for work, for danger. Markets filled squares with voices, smells of bread and meat, and the constant negotiation of price and survival. The medieval European city was chaotic, unequal, and often filthy, but it was alive with exchange. Stone and straw. Construction reflected social order. The wealthy built in stone, merchants, nobles, churches. Stone resisted fire, decay, and time. It symbolized permanence and power. The poor built in wood, wattle, and straw, materials cheap, flexible, and temporary. Entire neighborhoods could vanish overnight in a fire. This divide was visible everywhere. A cathedral's shadow might fall across a slum. A merchant's stone house might stand beside a thatched hovel. Urban planning was rarely deliberate. Cities grew organically, winding around rivers, roads, and old Roman ruins. Only churches and castles followed geometry. Everything else adapted. The result was a city that felt improvised, constantly rebuilding itself atop earlier mistakes. Who lived there? Medieval European cities were surprisingly small by modern standards. Paris in 1300 held perhaps 200,000 people, enormous for its time, but still limited by food supply and disease. Most cities housed fewer than 10,000. They were also dangerous places to live. Disease spread quickly, fires were frequent. Child mortality was high. Yet people kept coming. Why? Because cities offered something the countryside rarely did: opportunity. A skilled craftsman could earn wages. A merchant could accumulate wealth. A scholar could rise through education rather than birth. The city, for all its misery, offered movement: social, economic, intellectual. The American city: space, order, and meaning. Across the Atlantic, cities followed a different pattern. Pre-Columbian American cities, whether in Mesoamerica or the Andes, were often vast, planned, and deeply symbolic. They were not defined by charters or walls, but by cosmology. Take Teotihuacan, near modern Mexico City. By the early centuries AD, it held over 100,000 inhabitants, rivaling the largest cities in Europe more than a millennium later. Its streets followed a grid. Its central avenue aligned with celestial events. Residential compounds housed extended families, often with courtyards, drainage systems, and murals. This was not an accidental city. It was designed. Cusco, the city as cosmos. In the Inca world, Cusco was not merely a capital. It was the center of existence. According to Inca tradition, the city was shaped like a puma, a sacred animal. Its temples, plazas, and palaces aligned with mountains, rivers, and stars. The most sacred site, the Coricancha, was sheathed in gold and dedicated to the sun. From it radiated ritual lines connecting shrines across the landscape. Urban planning here was theology made stone. Cusco was clean, ordered, and regulated. Streets were swept, water flowed through channels. Buildings fit together with astonishing precision: stone blocks cut so tightly that a blade cannot slip between them. There were no markets in the European sense. Goods were distributed through state systems, not haggled over in squares. To a European merchant, such a city might have seemed lifeless. To an Inca subject, it was harmonious. Density versus distribution. One of the great contrasts between the two worlds lies in how cities related to their surroundings. European cities were dense islands surrounded by countryside. They consumed resources brought in by peasants and trade routes. They depended on rural labor, but rarely integrated it. In contrast, many American cities were embedded within their agricultural systems. Terraces, canals, and fields often reached right up to urban edges. The city did not dominate the countryside, it coordinated it. Urban life and rural life were less separate. Freedom and control. Here lies a difficult comparison. In Europe, cities were places of relative freedom. Guilds protected members, councils negotiated with kings. Citizens a limited group, but real possessed rights. In pre-Columbian American cities, especially under the Inca, urban life was more regulated. Residency often depended on state assignment. Labor and movement were monitored. The city was not a refuge from obligation. It was the heart of it. Which system was more advanced depends on what you value. Freedom or order, opportunity or stability. Night in the city. Imagine night falling in both worlds. In a medieval European city, torches flicker, gates close. Taverns echo with drunken voices. The smell of smoke and refuse hangs in the air. In Cusco, night is quieter. Ritual fires burn in temples. Guards patrol with purpose. The city sleeps according to ceremony. Both are human. Both are fragile. The question beneath the stones: were European cities more advanced because they fostered trade, innovation, and individual mobility? Or were American cities more advanced because they achieved scale, sanitation, and planning centuries earlier? The answer is not simple, because advancement is not a straight line. It is a choice repeated daily about how people live together. And as both worlds would soon learn, cities are only as strong as the forces that sustain them. In the next section, we will step deeper into daily urban life, into homes, workshops, streets, and neighborhoods to see how ordinary people actually lived within these very different cities. Because a city is not defined by its monuments, but by the routines of those who wake up inside it. Cities are remembered for their monuments, but monuments do not wake at dawn, do not fetch water, do not sweep floors or count coins by candlelight. To understand whether medieval Europe or pre-Columbian America was more advanced, you must leave the plazas and temples behind and step into the quieter spaces, the kitchens, workshops, courtyards, and alleyways where ordinary people lived out their days. It is here, in routine rather than ceremony, that a civilization reveals itself most honestly. Waking in a medieval European city. Morning in a medieval European city began with sound. Church bells rang before sunrise, calling monks to prayer and craftsmen to work. Roosters crowed from hidden courtyards. Carts rattled over uneven stone. You wake in a timber-framed house, the upper floor jutting out over the street. The room is small. Smoke from the hearth lingers in the air, stinging your eyes. There is little privacy. Beds are shared, often with children or apprentices. Water must be fetched from a public well. You carry a bucket down narrow stairs and into the street, stepping carefully around refuse. Waste disposal is informal chamber pots emptied into gutters, animal dung mixed with straw. Despite later exaggerations, medieval cities were not uniformly filthy, but cleanliness depended on neighborhood and status. Wealthier districts enforced rules. Poorer ones relied on habit and luck. You dress simply, wool if you can afford it, linen if you are fortunate. Color indicates status, bright dyes are expensive. Then work begins. Workshops and guild life. Urban labor in Europe centered on guilds, associations of craftsmen who controlled training, quality, and prices. If you are a baker, a cooper, a weaver, or a blacksmith, your entire identity is bound to your craft. The workshop is often your home. The street-facing room displays goods or hosts customers. Behind it, apprentices work under strict supervision. They live with you, eat with you, and are bound by years of service. Guilds provide security and constraint. They protect against competition, but they also restrict innovation. They ensure quality, but enforce tradition. To belong is to survive. To be excluded is to fail. Women participate widely, especially in brewing, textile work, and market trade, though their contributions are often invisible in records. Widows may inherit workshops. Wives manage accounts. Daughters spin, sew, and sell. The city hums with labor, repetitive, skilled, necessary. Markets, the pulse of the European city. Market day transforms the city. Farmers arrive at dawn, carts heavy with grain, vegetables, eggs, and cheese. Butchers hang meat from hooks. Fishmongers shout prices before spoilage sets in. Coins change hands constantly, silver pennies, debased and clipped. Arguments flare over weights and measures. Town officials inspect goods, enforcing fairness or at least the appearance of it. Markets are social spaces as much as economic ones. News spreads here, rumors of war, disease, or new taxes. A city breathes through its market. Yet hunger is never far. A bad harvest raises prices instantly. Bread riots erupt quickly and brutally. The urban poor live one price increase away from starvation. The city offers opportunity but little mercy. Home in an Andean or Mesoamerican city. Now imagine waking in Cusco or in a residential compound of Teotihuacan centuries earlier. Your home is not stacked vertically, but arranged around a courtyard. Walls are stone or adobe, roofs are thatch. The layout is deliberate space for cooking, storage, ritual. Water flows through channels. Waste is managed more systematically than in Europe, though not invisibly. Cleanliness is enforced not by fear of disease, but by order and obligation. You rise with the sun. There are no bells. Time is marked by light and shadow. Work is assigned according to status, age, and season. If you are an artisan, your craft is likely state-directed. Textiles, ceramics, metalwork all produced to exacting standards for redistribution, tribute, or ritual use. There is little market noise. Exchange happens through allocation, not bargaining. Food and the urban table. In medieval European cities, food varies sharply by class. The wealthy eat bread made from fine wheat, meat regularly, and drink wine or strong ale. The poor eat dark bread, pottage, and whatever scraps they can afford. Meals are heavy and repetitive. Spices exist but are costly. Fresh produce is seasonal. Malnutrition is common, especially among children. In Andean cities, diets are more stable. Maize, potatoes, quinoa, and beans form the base. Protein comes from llama, guinea pig, or dried fish transported from afar. State storehouses buffer scarcity. Famine is rarer though not impossible. The difference is not abundance, but predictability. Movement and surveillance. European urban life allows movement. You can change professions, travel, even relocate though not easily. Cities grow through migration, and anonymity exists in crowds. In contrast, Andean cities emphasize stability. Residency is monitored, labor is assigned. Movement requires permission. To a European, this might feel oppressive. To an Andean subject, it feels normal, a trade of freedom for security. Neither system is inherently superior. Each reflects a different fear. Europe fears stagnation. The Andes fear disorder. Children, elders, and time. In both worlds, childhood is brief. Children work early fetching water, tending animals, learning crafts. Elders are respected, but survival matters more than sentiment. In Europe, the poor elderly often beg. In the Andes, communal structures provide more consistent care, though hardship exists everywhere. Time moves differently. European cities live by the clock and calendar. Andean cities live by season and ritual. One rushes forward. The other circles. Disease and risk. European cities are dangerous to the body. Plague, dysentery, tuberculosis disease thrives in density and filth. Medical knowledge is limited. Prayer and bloodletting dominate. Andean cities are healthier overall, though vulnerable to malnutrition and altitude stress. Epidemics are rarer until European contact changes everything. In this sense, American cities are biologically advanced, adapted to their environment with fewer deadly risks. The feeling of belonging. Perhaps the most profound difference lies in how it feels to live there. In a European city, identity is fragile but flexible. You are your trade, your guild, your parish. But you can change at great risk. In an Andean city, identity is fixed but secure. You are your community, your duty, your place in the cosmic order. You are cared for but watched. Both systems demand sacrifice. Both offer meaning. Cities are compromises made visible. They trade space for proximity, freedom for safety, individuality for cooperation. In medieval Europe and pre-Columbian America, people solved these problems differently but with equal ingenuity. In the next section, we will see how these cities faced their greatest test. What happens when a city built for one world is forced into another? Because no city, however well designed, survives unchanged when history arrives at its gates. Cities are promises. They promise safety, opportunity, order, and meaning. But every promise has a limit, and history is often the story of what happens when a city can no longer keep the one it made to its people. For medieval Europe and pre-Columbian America, The breaking point came not from slow decay alone, but from sudden shocks: invasion, disease, economic strain, and the collapse of belief. When those forces arrived, cities revealed their true nature not in stone and straw, but in how they adapted, resisted, or fell silent. The shock of conquest in the Americas. When Spanish forces entered American cities in the 16th century, they encountered places unlike anything in Europe. Wide plazas, orderly streets, immense stonework cities that seemed ancient and strangely modern at once. Yet the conquest of these cities was often swift. Not because they were weak, but because they were built for a different kind of world. Cities like Tenochtitlan and Cusco were centers of ritual and administration, not fortresses in the European sense. They lacked the thick defensive walls and permanent garrisons typical of medieval European cities. Their security depended on political unity and ritual authority, both of which shattered when leaders were captured or killed. Once the symbolic center fell, the city's meaning collapsed with it. The Spanish understood this instinctively. They targeted temples, palaces, and plazas not just to claim space, but to erase legitimacy. Churches were built atop sacred sites. Stones from temples were reused in colonial buildings. The city was not destroyed, it was overwritten. Disease, the invisible sea. More devastating than steel was disease. Smallpox, measles, and influenza entered cities before conquistadors did. Urban centers, once symbols of order, became corridors of death. Entire neighborhoods emptied. Administrative systems failed because the people who ran them died. In Cusco, priests could no longer maintain rituals. In Mesoamerican cities, tribute systems collapsed as farmers vanished. Cities designed around coordination could not function without people. The grid remained. The courtyard stood, but the city's soul, its routines dissolved. Unlike Europe, which had centuries to adapt to plague, American cities faced demographic collapse within a generation. No urban system could survive that. Europe's cities under pressure. European cities faced their own crises, though spread across centuries rather than decades. The Black Death shattered urban life in the 14th century. Cities lost between a third and half of their populations. Markets fell silent, workshops closed. But Europe's cities were resilient in a particular way. They were not dependent on a single symbolic center. Power was fragmented between guilds, councils, bishops, and monarchs. When one institution failed, another filled the gap. Urban charters, property rights, and wage labor allowed cities to repopulate. Migrants arrived from the countryside. Vacant houses filled again. Europe's cities bent. They did not break. Fire, war, and reinvention. Medieval European cities burned often. Fire swept through wooden neighborhoods with terrifying speed. Yet fire also brought renewal. After destruction came rebuilding, often with stone, wider streets, new regulations. Disaster became an engine of urban evolution. Wars, too, reshaped cities. Sieges destroyed walls and economies, but they also forced innovation: stronger fortifications, better supply systems, new forms of governance. Cities learned to expect violence. They planned for it. American cities, by contrast, had not evolved under constant siege conditions. Their wars were ritualized, seasonal, or symbolic. The total war of conquest was alien. When it came, adaptation was nearly impossible. Colonial cities, hybrids, and replacements. After conquest, American cities did not vanish, they transformed. Spanish planners imposed European urban models. A central plaza, a grid of streets, churches, and administrative buildings at the core. These designs were not inherently superior, but they were portable, repeatable, and aligned with imperial control. Old cities became colonial capitals. New ones were built from scratch. But beneath the grid, the old city persisted. Indigenous neighborhoods survived at the edges. Ancient roads guided new streets. The city became layered pre-Columbian foundations beneath colonial stone. In Europe, cities also layered themselves Roman walls beneath medieval houses, medieval streets beneath modern boulevards. Urban history in both worlds became archaeology. Which cities were more advanced? By now, the question itself feels smaller than it did at the start. European cities were advanced in legal flexibility, trade networks, and adaptability. American cities were advanced in planning, sanitation, scale, and environmental integration. Each solved different problems. Each failed under different pressures. Advancement, it turns out, is not universal. It is contextual. A city perfectly suited for ritual unity may collapse under conquest. A city built for chaos and commerce may survive plague and fire. Neither is superior in isolation. What cities teach us? Cities are experiments in living together. They reflect fear as much as hope. Medieval Europe feared fragmentation, so it built walls, laws, and markets. Pre-Columbian America feared imbalance, so it built order, ritual, and integration. Both were right. Both were incomplete. Modern cities inherit both traditions: the grid and the market, the ritual plaza and the guild hall. We still argue over the same questions. How dense should we live? Who controls space? What do we owe one another? The stones have changed. The questions have not. A quiet ending. If you walk today through Paris or Cusco, Mexico City or Toledo, you are walking through failure and resilience layered together. Every street is a compromise. Every building is a negotiation with the past. Cities do not die all at once. They shed meanings, absorb others, and continue altered, scarred, but alive. And in that persistence lies their quiet triumph. Reflection. Medieval Europe and pre-Columbian America built cities not to impress the future, but to survive the present. They succeeded until the world changed faster than stone could adapt. Perhaps the most advanced city is not the one that lasts longest, but the one that teaches us how fragile permanence really is. Story 6. Tools, Metal, and Quiet Technologies. When people ask whether a civilization was advanced, they often imagine machines. Gears turning, metal shining, devices that move faster, cut harder, or last longer. But most of human history unfolded without spectacle. Progress happened quietly in how a blade was shaped, how a thread was spun, how a tool fit the hand that used it. If you want to understand the technological worlds of medieval Europe and pre-Columbian America, you must slow down. You must look not at what they lacked, but at what they chose to perfect. Because technology is not only about invention. It is about need, environment, and habit. A medieval European workshop at rest. Imagine stepping into a European workshop just before dawn. The fire has burned low overnight. Iron tools rest where they were placed the evening before. There is a hammer polished smooth by years of use. An anvil bearing small dents, each one a memory of force. Files, tongs, chisels, awls. Nothing here is decorative. Every object exists because it has proven itself useful. Medieval Europe inherited much of its tool tradition from Rome, then modified it slowly. The pace of change is deliberate. Innovation is welcome, but only if it does not disrupt reliability. A plow that breaks mid-season is worse than no improvement at all. Iron, Europe's quiet advantage. By the high Middle Ages, Europe had mastered iron production. Not perfectly, but thoroughly. Bloomery furnaces dotted forests. Charcoal production reshaped landscapes. Iron was not rare, but it was labor-intensive. Blacksmiths were central figures in any town. They shod horses, repaired plows, forged knives, hinges, nails, locks. Their work touched every other profession. Iron tools allowed deeper plowing, stronger fortifications, and more durable weapons. But perhaps their most important contribution was predictability. An iron blade behaved consistently. It could be repaired, reforged, reused. In a world where survival depended on routine, that mattered more than brilliance. The slowness of European innovation. Despite access to iron, medieval Europe did not innovate rapidly. There were no assembly lines. Standardization was limited. Tools varied by region, guild, and personal preference. A carpenter in Florence worked differently from one in York. Why? Because tools were embedded in tradition. Guilds discouraged radical change. Training emphasized imitation. A master's authority rested on doing things the proven way. Progress occurred but quietly, almost accidentally. A slightly better mold. A stronger joint. A handle shaped just enough to reduce fatigue. These changes rarely made chronicles, but they changed lives. Now step into an American toolmaker's space. In the Americas, you will not hear the ring of iron on iron. But do not mistake silence for simplicity. You find stone tools, obsidian blades sharp enough to rival steel. Bone awls. Wooden digging sticks hardened by fire. Metal exists gold, silver, copper, but rarely for cutting or plowing. It is shaped for beauty, symbolism, and ritual. This was not ignorance. It was choice. Obsidian, sharpness without metal. In Mesoamerica, obsidian was king. Volcanic glass fractured to a molecularly sharp edge. An obsidian blade could slice flesh cleaner than steel. Surgeons used it for procedures. Butchers relied on it daily. Its drawback was fragility. It chipped, it shattered. So tools were designed around replacement, not permanence. Blades were inserted into wooden frames and swapped out as needed. This modular thinking is strikingly modern. Andean stone and wood technologies. In the Andes, stonework reached extraordinary precision. Without iron tools, masons shaped stones so tightly fitted that a knife blade could not slip between them. This required patience, skill, and intimate material knowledge. Tools were simple. Technique was not. Wooden tools were adapted to altitude. Textiles replaced metal in many functions: ropes, slings, bindings. Fiber technology was advanced to a degree Europe would not match for centuries. Why no iron in the Americas? The absence of iron metallurgy in pre-Columbian America is often treated as a failure. But that assumes iron was necessary. Iron ores existed. The knowledge of heating and shaping metal existed. What did not exist was a compelling reason. Stone, wood, and fiber met agricultural needs. Terracing required precision, not brute force. Digging sticks worked better on mountain soils than heavy plows. There were no large draft animals requiring horseshoes or iron harnesses. Technology followed ecology, tools, and social structure. In Europe, tools were personal property. They belonged to individuals or workshops. They could be inherited, sold, stolen. In the Andes, many tools were communal. Issued, collected, redistributed. This difference mattered. European tools encouraged specialization and individual innovation. American tools encouraged standardization and collective labor. Neither approach is more advanced. They simply produce different societies. Maintenance over invention. Both worlds valued maintenance over novelty. A medieval millwright spent more time repairing water wheels than inventing new ones. An Andean administrator ensured tools were returned, repaired, and redistributed annually. Breakdown was more dangerous than stagnation. Innovation without stability risked famine. So change was slow, intentional. The body as technology. Perhaps the most overlooked technology in both worlds was the human body itself. In Europe, repetitive labor reshaped muscles and posture. A lifetime of hammering changed bone structure. In the Andes, altitude adaptation altered lung capacity. Foot travel trained endurance unmatched by mounted Europeans. Bodies adapted to tools, and tools adapted to bodies. Technology was not separate from humanity. It was embedded within it. What advancement really looked like. If you judge by metal alone, Europe appears ahead. If you judge by efficiency within environment, the picture blurs. An iron plow is useless on a mountain terrace. A digging stick is inefficient on European clay. Each civilization built what it needed, not what impressed outsiders. And that may be the most boring and most important truth of all. In the next section, we will look at how these tools were used not just for survival, but for power. How technology shaped warfare, hierarchy, and control in both worlds. Because a tool does not only build, it also enforces. A tool changes the world only when it is used on people. Not always violently. Often subtly through obligation, hierarchy, and control. In medieval Europe and pre-Columbian America, technology did not merely help individuals survive. It structured societies. It determined who worked, who ruled, and who decided how labor would be spent. The hammer and the plow, the sling and the spear, each carried authority as well as function. European tools and social hierarchy. In medieval Europe, ownership of tools often meant ownership of status. A knight's sword was not just a weapon, it was proof of class. A peasant's plow tied him to land he did not own. Iron tools reinforced feudal hierarchy. Those who controlled forges and mines controlled productivity. Lords maintained monopolies on mills, ovens, and presses. Peasants were required to use them and pay. Technology became a toll. The very act of grinding grain or pressing wine affirmed who held power. Weapons as social dividers. European warfare depended heavily on metal. Swords, armor, lances, crossbows expensive and specialized. This cost created separation. Only the elite could afford full martial equipment. Peasant militias existed, but they were poorly armed by comparison. Even when effective, they lacked prestige. Technology reinforced inequality not by efficiency, but by exclusivity. Guilds as technological gatekeepers. Guilds controlled not only skills but access. They limited who could learn certain techniques. They regulated tool design and usage. Innovation required permission. A new tool threatened established masters. So change moved slowly, filtered through authority. This protected quality. It also protected power. American technologies and collective control. In the Andes, tools rarely signified personal status. Weapons were standardized. Tools were issued according to task. The state, not the individual, controlled production. This allowed massive projects, roads, terraces, storehouses. Thousands worked with similar tools toward a common goal. Power flowed through coordination rather than ownership. Warfare without iron. American warfare relied on stone, wood, and fiber. But effectiveness did not depend on lethality alone. Weapons were designed to capture rather than kill. Prisoners had ritual value. The goal was dominance, not annihilation. This shaped technology. Weapons emphasized blunt force, entanglement, intimidation. Iron swords would have disrupted that logic. Logistics as hidden technology. The most powerful American tool was logistical. Road systems, runners, storehouses, these enabled control across vast territories. A sling is impressive. A supply chain is decisive. In Europe, logistics were fragmented. Cities and lords managed their own supplies. This limited scale but increased resilience. Technology and obedience. In both worlds, tools enforced obedience indirectly. A plow tied a peasant to seasonal rhythms. A labor quota tied an Andean farmer to state planning. Neither was free. Neither was fully oppressed. Technology created expectations. Expectations became norms. When tools failed, when technology could no longer support power, collapse followed. European lords lost control when labor became scarce after plague. Tools without workers meant nothing. Andean administrators lost control when disease erased coordination. Tools without systems meant nothing. Power was never in the object. It was in its use. The illusion of superiority. European conquerors mistook iron for inevitability. American societies mistook coordination for permanence. Both were wrong. Technology magnifies strengths and weaknesses. In the final section, we will ask the quietest question of all. What happens to a technology after the civilization that made it disappears? Because tools outlast hands, and their silence can be revealing. Long after voices fade and names vanish, tools remain. They rust, fracture, dull, and decay, but they endure longer than memory. Archaeologists often encounter civilization first through their tools. A broken blade, a worn grinding stone, a discarded spindle whorl. Yet these objects tell incomplete stories. They speak clearly about function. They whisper about meaning. To understand medieval Europe and pre-Columbian America, we must listen carefully to what their tools still say and what they no longer can. Europe's iron legacy. Iron tools survive unevenly. Moisture corrodes them. Soil devours them. What remains is often fragmented rusted knives, bent nails, warped horseshoes. Yet written records fill the gaps. Guild inventories, estate accounts, legal disputes. Europe remembered its tools because it wrote about them. Iron also shaped later history. Plow designs evolved into modern agriculture. Water wheels became turbines. The continuity is visible. A medieval hinge resembles a modern one. This creates the illusion of advancement, a straight line from past to present. The vanishing technologies of the Americas. American tools survive differently. Stone endures. Textiles rot. Wood disappears. What remains overrepresents stone and underrepresents fiber, wood, and food systems. The absence of iron becomes louder than the presence of sophistication. A stone blade looks primitive until you understand how it was used. The disappearance of perishable technologies distorts judgment. Road systems vanish into forests. Terraces erode into hillsides. Only recently have scholars begun to see what once existed. Misreading the past. For centuries, Europeans misread American tools. They saw absence where there was adaptation. They saw simplicity where there was specialization. Iron blinded them to alternatives. Advancement became synonymous with metallurgy, not outcome. This misunderstanding justified conquest. Technology as memory. Tools encode values. European tools emphasize durability, repair, inheritance. American tools emphasize replaceability, coordination, and rhythm. Neither is superior. Each reflects a worldview. What we still use. We still rely on medieval European technologies daily. Nails, hinges, gears, plows. We are only beginning to recover American ones: terracing, crop diversity, fiber engineering. Climate change has revived interest in ancient Andean methods. The past returns quietly. The question of advancement revisited. Which was more advanced? The question dissolves. Advancement is not universal. It is situational. A technology is advanced if it works until it doesn't. A final reflection. If you could hold a medieval hammer in one hand and an obsidian blade in the other, neither would feel backward. Both would feel deliberate. Both were made by people trying to live another day. Perhaps the truest measure of advancement is humility. The ability to recognize intelligence even when it does not resemble your own. Story 7. Writing, memory, and the shape of knowledge. Not all knowledge is written down, and not all writing preserves what matters. When historians compare medieval Europe and pre-Columbian America, the conversation often turns sharply toward writing: who had it, who did not, and what that supposedly reveals about advancement. Ink, parchment, books, and alphabets are treated as milestones, as if memory itself only becomes real once it is written. But if you slow your thinking, as this history asks you to do, you will see that writing is not simply a tool for recording facts. It is a choice about what deserves permanence, a choice about who controls knowledge, a choice about how the past is allowed to speak to the future. A quiet room in a medieval monastery. Imagine yourself in a monastery on a cold morning. Stone walls hold the night's chill. A narrow window lets in pale light. You sit at a wooden desk. Before you lies parchment, expensive, fragile, and precious. Ink is mixed carefully. Every stroke must count. The text you copy is not new. It is old, ancient, even. Most medieval European writing is repetition. Monks copy scripture, commentaries, legal codes, medical texts inherited from Rome or the Islamic world. Innovation is not the goal. Preservation is. Mistakes matter. A miscopied word could alter theology, law, or medicine. Writing here is slow, deliberate, and reverent. It is an act of devotion. Who could write in medieval Europe? Literacy in medieval Europe is narrow but deep. Clergy dominate written culture. Nobles may read, sometimes write. Merchants increasingly keep accounts. But the majority of people, peasants, laborers, women, interact with writing indirectly. They hear it read aloud. They see seals, symbols, and signatures. Writing belongs to institutions, not individuals. A charter defines land ownership. A will defines inheritance. A tax record defines obligation. Writing stabilizes power. What Europe chose to record. Medieval European writing focuses on law, property, theology, lineage, debt. Daily life appears only incidentally in court cases, censuses, or moral complaints. The boredom of history hides here. Lists of rents, grain yields, marriage contracts. Yet these dull records allow Europe's past to feel solid and continuous. Europe remembers itself because it wrote itself down. Memory without alphabet in the Americas. Now turn away from parchment. Turn toward voice, movement, and ritual. Pre-Columbian American societies did not lack memory. They lacked alphabets and chose other methods. In the Andes, memory lived in quipu, knotted cords arranged by color, position, and sequence. These were not primitive tally marks. They encoded numbers, categories, and likely narrative information. Specialists trained from youth read them fluently. In Mesoamerica, writing existed complex, symbolic, visual. Maya glyphs recorded dynasties, rituals, wars, and time itself. This was not lesser writing. It was different writing. Why writing looked different. Alphabetic writing thrives in societies focused on contracts, law, and portable authority. But in societies built on ritual, redistribution, and seasonal cycles, memory must live in bodies. Stories are danced. History is sung. Calendars are enacted. Knowledge is collective, not archived. This makes it resilient in one way and fragile in another. The strengths of oral and embodied memory. Oral systems are adaptive. They update. They respond to audience and context. A story told in drought differs from one told in abundance. This flexibility keeps knowledge relevant. It also prevents fixation. Writing freezes thought. Oral memory breathes. The catastrophe of erasure. When Europeans arrived, they destroyed not only cities and tools but memory systems. Codices were burned. Quipu were outlawed. Priests and record keepers were killed. An entire way of remembering vanished within decades. Europe's written memory survived conquest. America's embodied memory did not. History favors what can be stored on shelves. The illusion of superiority. Because Europe wrote more, it appears more advanced. But this is a bias of survival, not intelligence. What survives defines judgment. Imagine if Europe's monasteries had burned completely. Imagine if its records vanished. Would Europe appear simpler? What writing cannot capture. Writing excels at recording rules. It struggles with rhythm, tone, and nuance. It cannot capture how a field feels before rain, or how a community moves together. American memory systems preserved what writing ignores. Europe preserved what administration requires. Both are incomplete. A question that lingers. Which civilization remembered more? The one that filled shelves with ink, or the one that filled bodies with story? And when memory depends on survival, which is truly safer? In the next section, we will follow knowledge through crisis. What happens to memory when the people who carry it begin to disappear? Because writing preserves words, but living memory preserves meaning. And meaning is far easier to lose. Memory is strongest when it is used. It weakens when it becomes ceremonial, inherited, or assumed. Both medieval Europe and pre-Columbian America built systems of memory that worked remarkably well until pressure arrived. Famine, war, disease, conquest. In those moments, memory was tested not as an idea, but as a survival tool. Europe's written memory under strain. In medieval Europe, writing often outlived the people it described. During the Black Death, clerks died mid-record. Manuscripts ended abruptly. Legal documents referred to villages that no longer existed. Yet writing persisted. New scribes learned old hands. Institutions replaced individuals. Monasteries became memory vaults. Even when monks died, the structure remained. Writing allowed Europe to pause and then resume. Illiteracy and dependence. This resilience came with fragility. Because memory was centralized, ordinary people relied on institutions to remember for them. When records burned or were altered, peasants had little recourse. Written memory could be manipulated. Erasure could be legal. Power controlled what was remembered. American memory in motion. In the Americas, memory was distributed. Many carried it. Few owned it. This made it robust in normal times. It made it vulnerable in catastrophe. When disease killed elders, entire libraries vanished. A quipu without a reader was only string. The moment of collapse. Conquest did not simply remove memory, it replaced it. European writing redefined history. Indigenous memory was labeled myth. The past was rewritten in a foreign script. Adaptation and survival. Yet memory did not disappear entirely. Stories were hidden in Christian saints. Rituals disguised themselves as festivals. Language folded knowledge into metaphor. Memory learned to hide. Writing as control. European authorities relied on writing to govern. Taxes, labor, conversion. Writing became a weapon, which memory endured. Europe's memory survived intact but narrowed. America's memory fractured but remained alive. One became archived. The other became whispered. An unanswered question: is a memory safer on parchment, or in people who refuse to forget? In the final section, we will consider how modern historians try to recover what was lost, and whether it is possible to hear voices that were never meant to be written down. History often begins with silence, not the peaceful kind, but the kind left behind when voices are removed faster than they can be recorded. For medieval Europe, silence usually meant gaps in the archive, missing years, burned libraries, lost correspondence. For pre-Columbian America, silence meant something deeper: entire systems of memory erased before outsiders could understand them. Yet historians keep listening, not because they expect certainty, but because absence itself can speak. Europe's archive and its illusions. Europe's abundance of written sources creates confidence, but confidence can mislead. Most medieval documents were produced by elites. They reflect priorities of land, law, theology, and control. Peasant voices appear rarely filtered through court transcripts or moral sermons. Writing preserved Europe, but not evenly. Silence exists here too, hidden beneath ink. Reconstructing American memory. Recovering American knowledge requires patience and humility. Quipu are studied as data systems rather than primitive records. Oral traditions are compared across generations. Archaeology listens to landscape. Terraces, roads, and settlement patterns become texts. The land remembers even when people cannot. The danger of comparison. When historians ask which civilization was more advanced, they risk flattening difference into hierarchy. Advancement becomes a mirror of modern values. Writing appears superior only because we rely on it. But memory took many forms. What we are only now learning. Modern science increasingly validates indigenous knowledge. Crop diversity, soil management, climate adaptation. What was once dismissed as superstition proves precise. A shared fragility. Both worlds lost more than they preserved. Europe lost countless local traditions. America lost entire cosmologies. Survival does not equal completeness. A final reflection on memory. Perhaps the truest history is not what is written or spoken, but what is practiced. How people plant, how they build, how they care for one another. These habits persist even when stories fade. Closing thought. Medieval Europe and pre-Columbian America remembered differently. Neither was empty. Neither was whole. If advancement means knowing how to remember, then perhaps both succeeded and failed in equal measure. The past does not ask to be judged. It asks to be heard quietly, carefully, and without certainty. Story 8. Medicine, Bodies, and the Meaning of Health. Imagine waking in a world where illness is a constant companion. Not as a rare event, but as a daily risk. Your water may carry parasites. Your bread may harbor mold. Your neighbors may cough, and a single touch can carry death. In both medieval Europe and pre-Columbian America, survival was never guaranteed. Medicine was not a science in the modern sense. It was a set of practices, rituals, and observations honed over centuries. Understanding health requires patience. It requires attention to the mundane, to habits, to what people actually did rather than what we wish they knew. The European body and its caretakers. In medieval Europe, physicians were rare. They belonged to universities, studied Galen and Hippocrates, and treated the wealthy. Most people relied on midwives, barber surgeons, and herbalists. Knowledge was local, empirical, and sometimes contradictory. The body was understood through humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Illness meant imbalance. Treatment could be drastic: bloodletting, purging, or herbal remedies. It could also be mundane: rest, diet, and warmth. Hospitals existed, but mostly for the poor, pilgrims, or the dying. They were places of care, not cure. Public health in European cities. Cities, dense and crowded, were dangerous. Sanitation was minimal. Streets ran with waste. Rats carried plague. Wells could be contaminated. Authorities sometimes tried to intervene. Cleaning streets. Regulating slaughterhouses. Isolating the sick. Often, these measures were inconsistent. People learned survival through experience. Observation, gossip, and local knowledge became their most reliable medicine. Pre-Columbian medicine, observation and ritual. Across the Atlantic, medicine looked different. In the Andes, the Inca combined empirical observation with ritual. Herbal knowledge was extensive: coca leaves, quinine-like bark, and hundreds of plants treated pain, fever, and infection. Specialists existed: shamans, healers, midwives. They diagnosed disease with pulse, urine, and signs in the environment. But health was also spiritual. Illness could be punishment, imbalance, or intrusion by supernatural forces. Treatment involved both remedies and ritual: offerings, prayers, or ceremonies to appease spirits. Surgery and tools. Both worlds practiced surgery carefully, crudely, or somewhere in between. Europeans trepanned skulls to relieve pressure. Andean surgeons extracted parasites, set fractures, and performed amputations in battlefield conditions. Tools were simple: obsidian scalpels, metal knives, saws, and splints. Anesthesia was rudimentary: alcohol, herbs, or coca leaves reduced pain. Success rates were limited. Survival often depended on hygiene, luck, and immunity. Nutrition and daily health. Both civilizations relied on diet to support health. Europeans ate grains, legumes, occasional meat, and dairy. Seasonal scarcity left them vulnerable to malnutrition. Andean diets were richer in variety: potatoes, quinoa, maize, beans, and fish or llama protein. Yet both suffered deficiencies. Scurvy, anemia, parasites. These were daily threats. Medicine and nutrition were intertwined. Eating well was medicine. Labor was therapy. Childbirth and mortality. Childbirth was perilous everywhere. In Europe, maternal mortality was high. Midwives assisted, sometimes using herbs and ritual. Infant mortality was devastating. In the Americas, midwives and ritual played similarly vital roles. Ceremonies ensured protection. Knowledge of herbs saved lives. Pregnancy and birth were social events, deeply tied to community survival. The role of knowledge transmission. Medicine depended on memory and apprenticeship. In Europe, texts and manuscripts preserved techniques. In the Americas, oral transmission, observation, and ritual ensured continuity. Both systems had strengths. Europe preserved written theory over centuries. America preserved practical knowledge across generations. Both had vulnerabilities. Europe risked illiterate households misinterpreting texts. America risked knowledge disappearing with key individuals. A question that lingers: when disease struck, who survived? The one with books? The one with observation? And how much of health was truly in hands, herbs, and tools? and how much in social structure, ritual, and shared responsibility. In the next section, we will explore how epidemics, war, and conquest stress-tested these systems, revealing the fragility and ingenuity of human care in both worlds. Medicine exists in calm time, but it is tested in crises. Plague, famine, and war expose both the strengths and the fragility of healthcare systems. In medieval Europe and pre-Columbian America, crises revealed who would survive, who would adapt, and who would perish, often without ceremony or fanfare. The Black Death, a European reckoning. In 1347, the Black Death arrived in Europe. The disease spread with terrifying speed. Cities became pressure cookers. Narrow streets, shared wells, and dense housing allowed Yersinia pestis to move unhindered. Physicians could do little. They tried bloodletting, fumigation, amulets, and prayers. Some quarantined houses, but enforcement was inconsistent. Mortality rates were staggering. Estimates suggest between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population died within 5 years. The collapse of urban populations tested medicine, governance, and survival strategies. Responses and adaptation. Despite horror, European society adapted. Some cities developed rudimentary public health measures, cordoning off infected areas, regulating markets, burying corpses outside city limits. Guilds and monasteries maintained food and water supplies. Survivors learned through observation which treatments were dangerous and which practices reduced risk. Medicine became experiential. Communities learned fast, painfully, how to mitigate mortality. American epidemics before contact. In pre-Columbian America, epidemics were rarer. Population density in many regions was lower, and isolation limited contagion. Yet disease still existed. Parasitic infections, gastrointestinal illness, and respiratory infections took their toll. Medical practices focused on prevention and balance. Seasonal dietary adjustments, ritual cleansing, herbal treatments. The approach was holistic, blending biology, psychology, and cosmology. The catastrophe of contact. The arrival of Europeans changed everything. Smallpox, measles, influenza, and typhus spread faster than conquest itself. Entire communities died before resistance could form. Andean cities like Cusco lost large percentages of their population within decades. Mesoamerican urban centers, including Tenochtitlan, collapsed under demographic pressure. Medical systems, sophisticated as they were, could not respond to pathogens never encountered before. Healthcare in wartime. War stressed medicine in both worlds. In Europe, siege warfare created concentrated injuries and disease outbreaks. Hospitals and monasteries treated soldiers and civilians alike, often improvising with limited tools. European armies relied on surgeons, barbers, and field healers. Treatment was immediate, crude, and often fatal. In the Americas, warfare focused less on mass casualties and more on ritualized conflict. Healing was integrated into spiritual and community systems. Injured warriors were cared for communally, with an emphasis on rehabilitation. The difference was striking. European medicine adapted to sudden mass casualties. American medicine excelled in structured, smaller-scale care. Nutrition, labor, and health. Daily survival was intertwined with work. European peasants labored long hours with little nutrition. Malnutrition worsened vulnerability to infection. Communities learned preventive strategies, crop rotation, rationing, herbal supplements, but effectiveness varied. In Andean societies, state-managed redistribution of food helped buffer famine. Terraces, irrigation, and storehouses reduced seasonal scarcity. Health depended not only on individual care, but on social infrastructure. Medicine was not a separate discipline, it was part of governance. Childhood, disease, and demography. Child mortality shaped societies in both worlds. In Europe, mortality rates among children were high. Survival required careful feeding, hygiene, and attention to common illnesses. Written guides, advice from midwives, and communal wisdom all contributed to survival. In the Americas, infants were similarly at risk. Healers tracked growth and development. Rituals invoked spiritual protection. Communal care networks ensured that more children survived harsh conditions. Again, the balance between individual action and social structure determined outcomes. The role of belief. Belief shaped healing practices profoundly. In Europe, prayer, saints, relics, and astrological guidance were entwined with treatment. Illness was both physical and moral. In pre-Columbian America, spiritual observance was inseparable from healing. Shamans diagnosed not only disease, but imbalance with the cosmos. Treatments included offerings, song, and ritual movement, alongside herbs and physical care. Faith and observation were partners in survival, not rivals. Technology of health. Tools mattered but differently. Europeans relied on metal instrument scalpels, saws, forceps precise but scarce. Their use demanded training and stability. Americans relied on natural tools, obsidian, wood, fiber adapted to context. They emphasized accessibility, replaceability, and coordination. Effectiveness was situational. In the Andes, stone and fiber were sufficient for daily care and reconstruction. In Europe, metal instruments enabled more precise surgical intervention when available. A question that remains: when confronted with epidemics, famine, or war, which system was superior? Europe could respond with precise instruments and theoretical knowledge, but risked catastrophic failure in pandemics. The Americas excelled in integrated prevention and communal care, but could not withstand entirely novel pathogens introduced suddenly. Advancement, once again, is not absolute. It is a negotiation with environment, population, and circumstance. Unanswered threads. Medicine is not only about curing disease. It is about survival, adaptation, and the ability to teach the next generation. In both worlds, knowledge transmission was key. Texts in Europe. Ritual, apprenticeship, and practice in the Americas. The fragility of life made medical knowledge both precious and perishable. In the next section, we will explore how both civilizations responded to ultimate tests of their medical systems: conquest, societal collapse, and environmental shocks, and what that reveals about human ingenuity in the face of mortality. Medicine is often tested not in calm, but in catastrophe. The ultimate trial comes when populations collapse, resources vanish, and traditional knowledge is suddenly insufficient. For medieval Europe and pre-Columbian America, these moments revealed both ingenuity and fragility in ways that textbooks rarely capture. Europe: plagues, famine, and systemic stress. Europe experienced repeated waves of crisis. The Black Death of the 14th century was catastrophic, but famine, war, and smaller epidemics also stressed healthcare systems. Hospitals struggled under demand. Monastic infirmaries overflowed. Apothecaries and physicians were overwhelmed. Yet European institutions, guilds, monasteries, city councils allowed some continuity. Even as mortality rates soared, knowledge survived. Texts, procedures, and apprenticeship systems were preserved and transmitted. Adaptation followed. Streets were cleaned more systematically. Quarantines became formalized. Public health ordinances emerged. Medicine learned to operate within a fragile framework. It could fail locally but survive globally. The Americas: catastrophe and collapse. In contrast, the pre-Columbian Americas faced collapse through external disruption. Disease was an unprecedented shock. Smallpox, influenza, and measles traveled faster than the conquistadors themselves. Population loss was rapid and devastating. Entire neighborhoods emptied. Labor systems for terrace maintenance and irrigation collapsed. Storehouses went unused, crops failed. Healers and shamans, the carriers of communal memory, often perished. Quipu specialists, responsible for record-keeping, disappeared. Without people, sophisticated medical and administrative systems ceased to function. Unlike Europe, the system could not adapt quickly. Survival depended on continuity of community, which vanished almost overnight. Medicine and social order. In both worlds, health depended on social order as much as medical knowledge. In Europe, hospitals and monasteries could function because cities maintained some level of governance. Even after plagues, social networks preserved knowledge. In the Americas, the destruction of political authority undermined health care. Without organized labor, irrigation, and redistribution, even basic nutrition became scarce. Medical practices alone could not compensate for social breakdown. The role of belief in crisis. Crisis magnified the spiritual dimensions of medicine. In Europe, prayer, relics, and ritual remained central. People turned to saints when doctors could do nothing. Faith offered psychological relief, if not physical cure. In the Americas, rituals intensified. Sacrifices, offerings, and ceremonial healing were attempts to restore cosmic balance. Medicine and spirituality were inseparable. The body and the cosmos were one system. Ironically, these belief-based systems sometimes preserved resilience. Even when individuals fell, communal structure and ritual knowledge survived in memory. Tools and technology under pressure. Crises exposed the strengths and weaknesses of technological choices. Europeans relied on metal instruments, surgical tools, and water mills to support production and health. These were effective when labor was available. When population collapsed, tools were idle. Andean societies relied on non-metal tools, obsidian scalpels, wooden splints, and textiles. These were portable and accessible. They allowed rapid rebuilding until human carriers of knowledge disappeared. Technology amplified societal strengths, but it could not replace them. Childhood, nutrition, and demography. Mortality was highest among children. In Europe, the Black Death disrupted not only families but nutrition, education, and apprenticeships. Surviving children inherited labor shortages, but also opportunities. In the Americas, disease and conquest obliterated entire generations. Terraces fell into disrepair, crop yields declined, food security vanished. Medical knowledge alone could not ensure survival. Systems of labor, nutrition, and social organization were just as critical. What we can learn from failure. Both worlds teach humility. Europe's written memory and institutional structures allowed partial recovery. American systems excelled in prevention, coordination, and holistic care until external shocks exceeded capacity. The lesson is subtle. Survival is not only about technology or knowledge. It is about embedding care into society. It is about redundancy, flexibility, and adaptability. The human element. Medicine is ultimately human. In Europe, scribes preserved remedies. In the Americas, shamans transmitted knowledge through apprenticeship and ritual. Without people, no system, however sophisticated, endures. This underlines a quiet truth of history. The most advanced medicine is useless without community. A needle, a book, or a quipu can only guide hands that know how to use it. The question of advancement revisited. Which civilization was more advanced in health and medicine? Europeans had theory, books, and specialized tools. Americans had integration, prevention, and community-based care. Both systems had strengths, and both had vulnerabilities. Both adapted, both innovated, both failed. Advancement cannot be measured by survival alone. It is context-dependent. It is relational, not absolute. A quiet reflection. When you consider health in the medieval and pre-Columbian worlds, remember this. Medicine was never separate from daily life. Survival depended as much on social structures as on instruments or knowledge. Knowledge was fragile, stored in bodies, objects, and memory. Catastrophe tested ingenuity more than intellect. Human resilience is often invisible. It lies not in the victories recorded by history, but in the adaptations, improvisations, and small acts of care that allowed people to live another day. Medicine teaches that advancement is not a straight line. It is the negotiation between environment, society, and human ingenuity. It is fragile, fleeting, and deeply context-dependent. The bodies, tools, and practices of the past remind us that survival is an ongoing experiment, and that every civilization, no matter how advanced, must negotiate mortality itself.